Tonight we are going back to a specific window of time in the late 1990s. It was a period where the world felt like it was shifting into a new era, but in the dark corners of the map, people were stepping into shadows they never came out of. We have 11 stories to get through tonight, ranging from the turquoise waters of New Zealand to the silent locked rooms of the Vatican. This episode is designed to go along with the sound of rain to help you settle in and eventually find some sleep. If you find these stories meaningful, I would love for you to subscribe and maybe leave a comment letting me know what part of the world you are listening from tonight. It helps keep the fire going while we sit here in the dark. Before we begin, just a quick reminder to check the locks on your front door. It is probably nothing, but then again the like button has been acting a bit strange lately. It is almost like it is watching you back from the screen, waiting for a reason to flicker. Just a quick tap should be enough to keep it satisfied for now. Stay safe. Let us get into the first story. Hundreds of people stood on the shoreline of Endeavour Inlet and watched as the boat with two masts pulled away into the morning mist. They saw the brass portholes and the dark wooden hull. They watched two young people board that vessel and vanish. But according to the official police record, that boat never existed. To this day, the ocean has not given back the secret of where that second mast went, or why a man is sitting in a cell for a crime involving a boat he did not own. It was New Year's Eve in 1997. And the Marlborough Sounds in New Zealand were alive with a very specific kind of energy. This is a place where the mountains do not just meet the sea, they crumble into it, creating a labyrinth of sunken river valleys and deep turquoise water. There are no roads to Furno Lodge. If you want to get there, you arrive by boat and you leave the rest of the world behind at the jetty. Olivia Hope was 17 years old, and she was the kind of person who seemed to carry the light of the New Zealand summer with her. She was talented, a gifted singer with a quiet confidence that drew people in without her ever having to try. Her friend Ben Smart was 21. Ben was known for his easy smile and the way he looked out for the people around him. They were both from good families, and this trip was supposed to be the peak of their holiday. The lodge was packed that night. There were over 1,500 people crammed into a space meant for a fraction of that number. The air was thick with the smell of salt spray, spilled drinks, and the heat of 1,000 bodies dancing. Music drifted out over the water, muffled by the surrounding hills. Olivia and Ben were moving through the crowd laughing, caught up in the shared rhythm of a night where nobody wanted the sun to come up. For Olivia, the Marlborough Sounds felt like a second home. She spent her summers on her father's boat navigating the inlets and knowing the hidden coves by heart. She understood the water. She knew that out here the tides were strong enough to carry a heavy object miles out to sea in a single cycle. But on New Year's Eve, the water just looked like a black mirror reflecting the colored lights of the party. As the clock struck midnight, the celebration reached a fever pitch. People were jumping into the water, shouting resolutions into the dark and making plans they would not remember the next day. Ben and Olivia were right in the middle of it. They were young, they were safe, and they were surrounded by friends. There was no reason to think that this night would end any differently than the dozens of summer nights that had come before it. By 3 a.m, the energy of the party began to fray at the edges. The music was still thumping, but the exhaustion was setting in. Ben and Olivia were tired. They had spent hours dancing, and now they just wanted a place to sleep. The problem was that the lodge was overflowing, and the boat they were supposed to stay on was crowded and cramped. They started looking for an alternative, something a little more comfortable. They walked down to the jetty where the water taxi drivers were working overtime. The air was colder now, smelling of diesel exhaust and damp wood. They waited with a group of other partygoers, their breath visible in the flashlight beams. Ben had his arm around Olivia to keep her warm. They were just two more faces in the crowd waiting for a lift back to a bunk that was not quite waiting for them yet. Guy Wallace was the man behind the wheel of one of those water taxis. He was an experienced driver, someone who knew every boat in the bay by sight. That night, his eyes were stinging from the long shift, but he stayed focused. He watched the passengers climb into his small craft, their movements clumsy from the long night. He saw Ben and Olivia. They stood out because they were calm, clearly looking for a way to end their night peacefully. When the water taxi pulled away from the jetty, the lights of Furno Lodge began to shrink. The sound of the music faded into a low, rhythmic hum. Guy steered the boat toward a group of yachts moored in the deeper water. He was looking for the vessel where Ben and Olivia said they had a place to stay. but the bay was a forest of masts and rigging, and everything looked different in the dark. That was when a man sitting in the back of the taxi spoke up. He was scruffy with several days of stubble and hair that looked like it had not seen a comb in weeks. He told Ben and Olivia that he had a yacht nearby and that they were welcome to sleep there. He pointed into the darkness toward a boat that sat slightly apart from the others. He seemed casual, almost bored, like he was just offering a neighborly favor. Ben and Olivia looked at each other. They were exhausted, and the prospect of a quiet cabin was better than the floor of a crowded boat. They agreed. Guy Wallace steered the taxi toward the vessel the man pointed out. As they got closer, Guy noted the details of the boat. It was a two-masted ketch built of wood with white paint and distinctive brass portholes that caught the light of his torch. The water taxi pulled alongside the ketch. The scruffy man climbed out first, then reached back to help Olivia and Ben onto the deck. Guy Wallace watched them for a second. He saw the two young people step onto the wooden planks and walk toward the cabin. The man stayed on deck looking back at Guy. There was no waving, no shouting, just a silent figure standing under the rigging of a boat that looked solid and real. Guy turned his taxi around and headed back toward the lodge. He had more passengers to pick up, more trips to make before the sun came up. He did not think much of it at the time. Out here people shared boats all the time. It was the culture of the sounds. He watched the silhouette of the two-masted ketch disappear into the early morning mist as he accelerated the wake of his boat, the only thing moving in the bay. When the sun finally rose over the Marlborough Sounds on New Year's Day, the mist was thick and heavy. It clung to the surface of the water like a wet blanket. Friends of Ben and Olivia began to wake up on their respective boats, rubbing their eyes and looking for the pair. They expected to see them at the lodge for breakfast, or perhaps sleeping late on one of the nearby yachts. But as the hours passed, the empty space they left behind began to grow. By noon, the casual searching had turned into a focused hunt. Calls were made to other boats. People walked the shoreline, calling their names into the dense bush. The silence that came back was wrong. It was too deep. Ben and Olivia were not the type to just wander off without a word. They had left their belongings behind. Their bags were still sitting exactly where they had dropped them the night before. A local fisherman was the first to notice something else was missing. He had been out in the bay early that morning before the mist had fully lifted. He remembered seeing a two-masted ketch with brass portholes pulling its anchor and motoring out toward the open sea. It had moved slowly, almost ghost-like, through the gray light. Now, as the search intensified, that boat was nowhere to be seen in the entire inlet. The police arrived on January 2nd, and the atmosphere in Endeavour Inlet changed instantly. The holiday vibe evaporated, replaced by the clinical precision of a missing persons investigation. Divers were sent into the turquoise water, their fins disappearing into the depths. They searched the seabed under the moorings, looking for anything that might have fallen overboard. They found nothing but old anchors and discarded bottles. Detective Inspector Rob Pope was the man in charge. He was a methodical investigator, someone who believed in evidence over anecdotes. He began interviewing the hundreds of witnesses who had been at the lodge. Very quickly, a pattern emerged. Dozens of people described the same boat. They talked about the two masts. They talked about the scruffy man. They talked about the brass portholes that gleamed in the moonlight. Guy Wallace sat in a small room and told the police exactly what he had seen. He was certain. He had dropped them at a two-masted wooden ketch. He had seen them step onto the deck. He provided a detailed description of the man who invited them aboard. But as the investigation ground on, the police began to grow frustrated. They could not find any record of a two-masted ketch matching that description anywhere in New Zealand. Instead, the police began to focus on a man named Scott Watson. Watson was 36 years old, and he had been at the party that night. He had a criminal record mostly for minor offenses, and he had a reputation for being difficult and abrasive. More importantly, he owned a boat called the Blade. The problem was that the Blade was a single-masted sloop made of steel, and it looked nothing like the boat Guy Wallace described. The detectives searched the Blade from top to bottom. They stripped the interior, looking for any trace of Ben or Olivia. They were looking for a single hair, a drop of blood, or a fiber from their clothing. For weeks, they found absolutely nothing. The boat was clean. Scott Watson maintained his innocence, claiming he had spent the night alone on his boat and had never even met the two young people. The pressure on the police was immense. Two young people from prominent families had vanished into thin air, and the country was demanding an arrest. The theory began to shift. The police argued that Guy Wallace and the other witnesses were simply mistaken. They suggested that in the dark and the confusion of the party, a single-masted boat could look like a two-masted ketch. They claimed the mystery ketch was a figment of tired imaginations. In 1998, the police finally found what they were looking for. Two hairs were recovered from a blanket on Scott Watson's boat. One was identified as belonging to Olivia Hope. This became the cornerstone of the case. The prosecution argued that Watson had lured them to his boat, killed them, and disposed of their bodies in the deep waters of the Cook Strait. They claimed he had cleaned the boat so thoroughly that only those two hairs remained. The trial in 1999 was a national obsession. The defense pointed out the sheer impossibility of the timeline. For Watson to have committed the crime, he would have had to kill two people, clean a blood-spattered boat, and dispose of the bodies in a bay filled with other boats, all within a 3-hour window. And he would have had to do it while people were still awake and moving around the water. Guy Wallace stood on the witness stand and refused to change his story. He insisted that the boat he dropped the victims at was not Scott Watson's boat. He knew the difference between a sloop and a ketch. He knew what he saw. But the jury was presented with the DNA evidence of the hair, and the image of Watson as a violent predator was pushed hard by the prosecution. After 11 weeks, Scott Watson was found guilty. The missing mast became the riddle that haunted New Zealand. If the witnesses were right, then a killer had escaped on a wooden yacht that the police simply gave up on finding. If the police were right, then dozens of sober, experienced boaties had all suffered from the same collective hallucination at the exact same time. The turquoise water of the Sounds kept its secrets, and the bodies of Ben and Olivia were never found. Gerald Hope, Olivia's father, spent the next 2 decades in a state of suspended grief. He wanted to believe the police had the right man, but the inconsistencies gnawed at him. He eventually went to the prison to meet Scott Watson face to face. He sat across from the man convicted of killing his daughter and looked into his eyes. He wanted a confession, a location, or a sign of remorse. Instead, he found a man who seemed just as trapped as the truth itself. By 2020, new technology began to cast a shadow over the original conviction. Forensic experts reviewed the way the hair samples were handled in 1998. They discovered that the samples from the boat and the samples from Olivia's hairbrush had been handled in the same laboratory at the same time. The possibility of accidental contamination became a terrifying reality that the legal system had to confront. As of early 2026, Scott Watson remains behind bars, having served over 26 years. A high-level judicial review is currently analyzing the forensic evidence, and the case is now considered the most significant potential miscarriage of justice in the history of the country. The two-masted ketch has never been found, but the memory of it still drifts through the Marlborough Sounds whenever the mist rolls in. People often talk about the ocean as a place of freedom, but for those who know the story of Endeavour Inlet, it is a place of absolute crushing weight. The water is hundreds of feet deep in the center of the Sounds, and the currents move with a silent, relentless power. Sometimes the thing that undoes a person is not the danger itself, but the moment right before, when everything still looked like a path home. The coast of Namibia is a place where the logic of the world seems to fold in on itself. It is a land of red sand dunes that can reach 1,000 feet in height, dropping directly into the freezing, violent currents of the Atlantic. It is called the Skeleton Coast because for centuries it has been a graveyard for ships that were blinded by the fog and inhaled by the desert. It was late 1997, and the bridge of the Viviana felt like a glass bubble floating in a void of pure white. The fog was so thick that the bow of the 70-foot fishing trawler was nothing more than a ghost appearing and disappearing with every heavy swell. The captain stared at the radar, watching the green sweep rotate over and over, but there was nothing out there but the flat, empty signature of the Atlantic. The crew was a tight group of men who had spent most of their lives working the cold, nutrient-rich waters of the Benguela Current. They were used to the isolation that comes with deep-sea fishing, where the only thing between you and the end of the world is a few inches of steel and a reliable engine. For them, the ocean was not a mystery. It was a workplace with rules that they respected and followed every single day of the year. This part of the Namibian coastline is known by a very specific and ominous name, the Skeleton Coast. It is a place where the oldest desert on the planet meets the sea with a violent, crushing energy. The cold water from the south hits the hot air of the desert, creating a permanent wall of mist that can blind a ship in minutes. It is a landscape of extremes, where the geography itself seems designed to confuse anyone who dares to navigate it. The Viviana was built for these conditions. She was a sturdy vessel equipped with the best navigation gear available in the late 90s. The crew felt a sense of pride in her ability to handle the unpredictable nature of the Namibian coast. They spent their days in a steady rhythm of dropping nets and hauling in the silver harvest of the deep. It was a good life defined by hard work and the shared silence of men who understand the sea. Most of the men on board had families waiting for them in the small port towns to the south. They thought about home in the quiet hours of the night during the long stretches between the heavy lifting. They were motivated by the goal of a successful catch and a safe return. The ship was their home, their shelter, and their primary source of life. As long as the engine was humming, everything in their world felt stable and correct. The Benguela Current is an invisible river within the ocean, carrying millions of gallons of frigid water northward. It is what makes the fishing so productive, but it is also what makes the region so deadly. The current is powerful enough to push a ship miles off course if the captain is not paying close attention. It is a constant force that requires constant vigilance, a silent partner that can turn into an enemy without a single moment of warning. In the late 90s, satellite navigation was still becoming the standard, and many crews still relied heavily on radar and dead reckoning. The captain of the Viviana was a master of his craft, a man who could feel the movement of the water in his bones. He knew the sounds of the ship and the behavior of the swells. He navigated by instinct as much as by instrument, trusting the vessel to tell him when something was starting to go wrong. The coast itself is 1,000 miles of uninhabited dunes, some rising nearly 1,000 feet into the sky. There are no lights, no landmarks, and no safe harbors for hundreds of miles in either direction. If a ship gets into trouble here, there is no one to hear the call and no way to reach the shore. It is a place of absolute primal solitude, where the land is just as dangerous as the water that beats against its jagged edges. For several days, the fishing had been extraordinary. The hold was nearly full, and the mood on the ship was high. They were ahead of schedule and looking forward to an early return. The sea was calm, though the fog had been persistent for nearly 48 hours. It was the kind of weather that felt like a thick, wet blanket draped over the entire world, muffling the sound of the waves and keeping the sun hidden from view. The crew spent their off hours in the galley sharing stories and drinking strong coffee. They talked about the things they would buy with their bonus and the people they would see. There was a sense of accomplishment in the air, a feeling that they had once again mastered the most difficult waters on Earth. They were professionals, and the success of the trip was a testament to their skill and their endurance in the face of the elements. As the Viviana began her turn back toward the south, the captain noticed a subtle shift in the vibration of the hull. It was not a mechanical sound, but a rhythmic rubbing like something soft was pressing against the steel below the waterline. He checked the depth sounder, which showed hundreds of feet of water beneath the keel. There should have been nothing but empty space between the ship and the rocky floor of the ocean. He stepped out onto the wing of the bridge, trying to peer through the whiteout. The air was cold and damp, smelling strongly of salt, and something else he could not quite place. It was a dry, dusty scent that did not belong this far out at sea. He listened closely, but the only sound was the low thrum of the diesel engine and the splashing of the wake. Everything seemed normal, yet his instincts were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. Suddenly, the green sweep of the radar flared with a solid, massive signature. It was not a ship or a rock. It was a wall that seemed to stretch for miles. He immediately cut the engines and ordered the crew to the deck. The ship continued to glide forward under its own momentum, the silence growing heavier with every second. The captain gripped the railing, his knuckles turning white as he stared into the featureless fog ahead of them. The first offbeat detail was a sound that made no sense in the middle of the Atlantic. It was a dry, abrasive hissing like 1,000 snakes were moving across a flat surface. It was the sound of the wind, but it was not moving through the rigging. It was moving across the water. The ship began to slow down much faster than it should have, as if the water itself was becoming thick and resistant to the movement of the hull. A heavy vibration shuddered through the entire vessel, followed by a long, low, grinding noise. It was not the sharp crack of a ship hitting a reef. It was a soft, muffled thud that felt like the boat was being pushed into a giant sponge. The Viviana tilted slightly to the port side, and then came to a complete jarring halt. The engine died with a final coughing sputter, leaving the crew in a silence so deep it felt heavy. The men on deck looked at each other in confusion. They could see nothing but the white fog, yet the ship was perfectly still. There was no movement from the waves, and the rhythmic swaying they had lived with for weeks had simply vanished. One of the crew members leaned over the side and reached down with a long boat hook. When he pulled it back up, the end was not dripping with salt water. It was covered in a thick, fine layer of red sand. The captain realized then that the pressure rising against the hull was not the sea. They were aground, but they were not on a rock. They had sailed directly into the land. The fog and the current had conspired to push them miles off course, leading them straight into a section of the coast where the dunes extend out into the shallow surf. They were pinned between the weight of the desert and the retreating tide, completely cut off from the ocean. As the fog began to lift a few hours later, the discovery was more terrifying than any of them could have imagined. They were not just on the beach, they were surrounded by sand. The tide had gone out, and the Viviana was sitting perfectly upright in a shallow basin of red dunes. The ocean, which had been their entire world just hours before, was now a distant white line of surf, nearly 500 meters away from where the ship was resting. The crew stepped off the side of the ship, their heavy boots sinking into the dry, scorching sand. The heat was immediate and intense, a physical weight that pressed down on them from the cloudless sky. They were used to the cold and the damp, and this sudden transition was disorienting. They stood in the shadow of their own ship, looking out at an infinite landscape of shifting dunes that looked more like the surface of Mars than the Earth. There were no tracks, no plants, and no signs of life in any direction. The horror of the skeleton coast is the realization of its absolute hostility. The water is right there, but you cannot drink it. The land is vast, but it offers nothing but heat and thirst. They were survivors of a shipwreck, but they had not been washed ashore by a storm. They had been delivered into a furnace by the very current they had trusted to guide them home. The initial search for the Viviana began when the ship failed to check in at its scheduled time. For days, planes and boats searched the area where the captain had last reported his position. They found nothing. The ocean was empty, and there were no signs of debris or oil. It was as if the ship had simply been deleted from the map. The search was eventually scaled back as the authorities assumed the vessel had been lost with all hands in the deep. In early 1998, a specialized recovery team was hired to make one final attempt to find the wreck by land. They used heavy 4x4 vehicles and followed the coastline from the north, navigating the treacherous terrain between the high dunes and the surf. It was an arduous journey through a place where a single mistake could lead to being buried alive by a shifting wall of sand. They were looking for a grave, not a ship. After weeks of searching, one of the scouts noticed a strange metallic glint on the horizon. As they got closer, the sight was so surreal that they stopped their vehicles in total disbelief. There, in the middle of a massive red dune, sat the Viviana. She was nearly a kilometer from the actual shoreline now. The ship was perfectly preserved, looking like it had been placed there by a giant hand as a monument to the power of the desert. The investigation into the site revealed a clue that changed the entire meaning of the tragedy. When the recovery team climbed onto the deck, they found that the ship was not empty. They found signs of a desperate struggle for survival, but not against the elements. There were deep gouges in the wooden deck, and the heavy steel doors had been dented from the outside. They found footprints in the sand on the deck that were too large to be human. The twist was that the crew of the Viviana had not been alone in the desert. The skeleton coast is one of the only places on Earth where lions have adapted to live in the dunes and hunt along the beaches. These predators are leaner, tougher, and far more aggressive than their inland cousins. For the lions, the ship sitting in the dunes was a high-ground lookout, and the men inside were nothing more than prey trapped in a metal box. The climax of the recovery mission came when the team realized they were being watched. From the top of a nearby dune, 3 desert lions were silhouetted against the sun, watching every move the men made. The team had to work in a state of constant high-intensity pressure, knowing that they were the intruders in this landscape. The desert was not just a place of heat and sand. It was a territory owned by things that thrived in the dark. The truth revealed by the forensic reconstruction is a masterpiece of environmental horror. The Benguela Current creates a massive longshore drift that moves millions of tons of sand along the coast every year. When a ship runs aground, the sand accumulates around it so fast that it creates a new piece of land within months. The Viviana did not move. The shore grew around her, pulling the ship deeper into the desert while the ocean retreated further away. The recovery team found the remains of the crew miles away from the ship, scattered along the dunes. They had tried to walk toward the south, hoping to find a ranger station or a mining camp. They had been caught between the infinite thirst of the Namib and the specialized hunters that followed them through the dunes. There is a specific kind of cruelty in a place that allows you to see the water while you are dying of thirst. The killer in this story is the environment itself, a combination of shifting sand and predatory patience. The desert-adapted lions are a unique detail of this coast, a force of nature that treats the ruins of human technology as part of their hunting ground. They do not fear the ships, they use them. They are the final wardens of a place where humanity was never meant to stay, ensuring that anything that enters the dunes stays there forever. The cold ending of the Viviana is one of absolute erasure. Today, the ship is no longer the proud fishing vessel it once was. It is a buckled, rusted skeleton that is slowly being swallowed by the very dune that captured it. It is a popular site for the most extreme adventurers, but even they do not stay past sunset. They know that the desert is always moving, and the shore is never quite where it seems to be. In 2026, a high-resolution satellite confirmation showed that the hull of the Viviana has finally collapsed under the immense weight of the sand. The desert has won its long, slow battle with the steel. The ship is now almost entirely buried, a hidden tomb in a landscape that does not keep records. It is a reminder that the land can be just as hungry as the sea, and sometimes it is even harder to escape. The red dunes of Namibia carry the weight of 1,000 shipwrecks, each one a secret kept by the shifting sand. But as you move north from the skeleton coast and cross the Mediterranean, the geography changes from the infinite desert to a landscape of ancient olive groves and limestone hills. In the southern part of Greece, the trees are older than the cities, and the silence there holds a much darker and more human kind of hunter. The sun over the Peloponnese in 1997 was a heavy physical presence that seemed to bake the scent of wild thyme and dried earth into every breath you took. In the rural outskirts of Kalamata, the world is dominated by ancient olive groves, where the trees are hundreds of years old. Their trunks are twisted into silver-gray knots that look like petrified muscle standing in silent rows over a carpet of brittle, sun-bleached leaves. Eleni had walked these groves her entire life, following the same dirt paths her grandmother had used during the harvest. At 62 years old, she moved with a practiced rhythm, her leather boots making a predictable crunch against the dry ground. She carried a woven basket on her arm and a small, sharp knife tucked into her apron. To her, the trees were not just a landscape. They were a community of silent giants that provided a sense of continuity. Every afternoon, when the heat began to lose its sharpest edge, Eleni would head out to check the progress of the ripening fruit. The groves were a maze of light and shadow where the low-hanging branches created tunnels of cool, green-tinted air. She knew which trees were thirsty, which ones were thriving, and where the limestone soil was the most giving. It was a simple, uncomplicated existence that relied on the predictable cycles of the seasons. The village of Kalamata was a place where everyone was a familiar face, and the background noise of life was the sound of church bells and distant tractors. In the local taverna, the men would talk for hours about politics and the price of oil, while the women shared news from the neighboring farms. There was a collective understanding that they were shielded from the chaos of the city by the rugged mountains that rose behind them. Eleni found comfort in the presence of the military barracks located just outside the town. Often she would see the young soldiers in their green fatigues standing tall and disciplined as they went about their drills. They represented order and protection, a reminder that the country was being watched over by its strongest sons. When a jeep would pass her on the road, she would offer a polite nod, and the driver would always return the gesture. Her house was a modest stone building with a small courtyard where she grew lavender and rosemary. In the evenings, she would sit by the window and watch the sky turn a deep bruised purple over the Messinian Gulf. The air would fill with the sound of cicadas, a constant vibrating drone that signaled the end of another quiet day. Nothing in her environment ever suggested that the shadows between the trees could hold anything but more trees. She had a routine that rarely deviated, even when the wind changed or the birds were unusually quiet. Eleni believed that if you respected the land would respect you in return. She never felt isolated in the groves, even when she was miles from the nearest house. The silence was not empty. It was full of the history of her people carved into the very rocks she stepped over every day. One Tuesday in late September, Eleni noticed that the wind was carrying a different scent, one that was slightly metallic and out of place. She paused by a particularly old tree, its branches sagging under the weight of the fruit. She felt a brief, strange tightness in her chest, a sudden awareness of how far she was from the road. But she dismissed it as a trick of the heat and continued her work, her knife moving with steady precision. Eleni was not a woman who prone to imagination or flighty thoughts. She had raised 4 children and buried a husband, and she took pride in her practical, grounded nature. When the local priest, Father Nicolaus, spoke about the old legends during Sunday service, she would listen with respect but without true belief. To her, the world was made of stone, wood, and water, not ghosts or shadows that could move of their own accord. She often walked past an abandoned stone hut on the edge of her family's property. It was a crumbling ruin with a caved-in roof, its walls slowly being reclaimed by ivy and wild vines. She had played there as a child, but now it was just a landmark that told her she was halfway through her walk. The door was a rotting piece of timber that hung by a single rusted hinge, creaking softly whenever the breeze caught it. As the weeks went by, the village began to feel a subtle, creeping change in its collective mood. People were returning home earlier in the evening, and the lively chatter at the taverna seemed more subdued. There were whispers about women from the neighboring villages who had failed to return from their own groves, but these were distant stories muffled by the mountains, and Eleni did not let them disturb her peace. She felt that as long as she stayed within the boundaries of the land, she knew she would be fine. The soldiers were still there, patrolling the roads in their heavy trucks, their presence a constant, reassuring beat in the background of her life. She trusted the green fatigues. She trusted the discipline of the men who wore them. They were the guardians of the Peloponnese, and their strength was her shield. The first offbeat detail appeared on a Thursday morning when the dew was still clinging to the silver leaves of the olive trees. Eleni was walking toward the abandoned stone hut when she saw something bright caught on a low-hanging branch. It was a small piece of off-white lace, perfectly clean and neatly tied in a small bough. It stood out against the gray wood like a scream in a silent room, completely alien to the rugged environment. She reached out to touch the fabric, her fingers brushing against the delicate thread. It was expensive, the kind of lace used for a fine wedding garment or a christening gown. There was no reason for it to be there, miles from any house and far from the main road. As she untied the bow, she noticed that the branch had been carefully trimmed to hold the lace in place, as if someone had spent a great deal of time on the presentation. Eleni felt a sudden cold prickling of sweat at the base of her neck. She looked around, searching the gaps between the trees, but everything was perfectly still. The silence of the grove suddenly felt heavy, pressing against her ears like deep water. She shoved the lace into her pocket and walked home much faster than usual, her breath coming in short, shallow hitches. She did not look back at the stone hut, but she felt as though the trees were watching her departure. Father Nicolaus was the first person to enter the abandoned stone hut 3 days later, looking for a missing goat that had wandered off from the church property. He pushed open the rotting door and was immediately hit by the scent of sun-baked wild thyme, mixing with something far heavier and more iron-scented. The interior was dim, but a shaft of light from the broken roof illuminated a scene that made his knees buckle and his hand fly to his crucifix. Inside the hut, the floor had been swept clean of dust and leaves, leaving only the bare, packed earth. Arranged in the center of the room was a collection of clothing that had been meticulously deconstructed and laid out like a puzzle. There were dresses, scarves, and undergarments, each one showing a clean surgical line where it had been cut from a body. But there were no people there, only the echoes of their absence and the silent, terrifying order of the display. The priest backed away from the hut, his breathing ragged and his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't look at the walls where more pieces of lace were pinned to the stones in perfect geometric patterns. He ran back toward the village, his black robes fluttering behind him like the wings of a crow. He did not call for the goat anymore. He knew with a cold, primal certainty that something unnatural had taken up residence in the groves. Inspector Sideris arrived from Athens 48 hours later, bringing with him a team of forensic experts who looked completely out of place in the dusty Peloponnese. He was a lean man with tired eyes who had spent his career studying the worst of human nature. As he stood inside the stone hut, he didn't see the work of a vampire or a ghost. He saw the work of a man with incredible patience and access to very specific, high-quality tools. The investigator noted that the cuts in the fabric were not the result of a struggle. They were precise, following the anatomy of the human body with the skill of a surgeon or a tailor. There was a lack of blood in the hut, which suggested that the actual violence had happened elsewhere, and this place was merely a gallery. Sideris felt a deep, cold weight in his stomach as he realized they were looking for someone who viewed murder as a form of meticulous craft. He began to track the reports of missing women across the region, finding 9 cases that had been dismissed as accidents or runaways over the last 2 years. Each one followed a similar pattern: a woman alone in an orchard, a sudden disappearance, and no evidence left behind. The villages were now paralyzed by a fear they could not name, believing that a phantom was hunting them. Sideris knew the phantom was made of flesh and bone. The pressure in the community reached a breaking point when a local woman reported being watched by a man who stood perfectly still in the deep shadows of her grove. She described him as a figure that didn't seem to breathe, blending so perfectly with the gray trunks that she almost walked right into him. When she screamed, he didn't run. He simply stepped back into the darkness and was gone before her husband could reach the spot. Sideris focused his investigation on the military barracks, a move that local officials met with immediate and angry resistance. They could not believe that one of their protectors could be the source of the horror. But the inspector pointed to the reconnaissance training. The soldiers received the ability to move through difficult terrain without being seen, and the discipline required to watch a target for weeks without making a sound. The twist came during a routine check of the duty logs from 1997. Sideris found that one particular soldier, Kyriakos Papakronis, had been on leave or assigned to remote patrols during every single disappearance. Papakronis was a high-ranking NCO, a man known for his absolute silence and his impeccable appearance. When Sideris looked at a photograph of the man, he saw a face that was a mask of cold intellectual detachment. A witness from a village 10 miles away came forward with a piece of information that broke the case wide open. She had seen a military jeep parked near a remote limestone crevice late at night, and she had recognized the driver as the man who had once helped her move a broken cart. It was Papakronis. He hadn't been acting as a soldier that night. He had been a man working in the dark, moving a heavy leather-bound bundle into the rocks. The climax arrived on a moonless night when the police surrounded a small, isolated house on the outskirts of Kalamata. Sideris led the way, his pulse, a steady, heavy thrum in his neck as they moved through the lavender-scented courtyard. The door was locked, but they used a battering ram to clear the path. Inside, they found Papakronis, sitting at a kitchen table perfectly still, his hands resting flat on the wood as if he had been expecting them. The air in the house was thick with the smell of sun-baked thyme and something sharper like formaldehyde. In the basement, they found the ultimate horror, a collection of skin and fabric that had been preserved and displayed with the same surgical precision seen in the stone hut. Papakronis didn't fight, he didn't speak. He simply watched the officers with a calm, analytical gaze as if he were studying their reactions for a future project. The investigation revealed that Papakronis saw himself as a sculptor of death. He would watch a village for weeks, learning the rhythms of the women who walked the olive groves alone, using his reconnaissance training to remain invisible. He viewed his victims not as people, but as materials to be shaped and arranged. The 1997 trial shocked the nation, as it was the first time they were forced to face the reality of a homegrown serial predator. The military man had used his position of trust as a blind, allowing him to move through the Peloponnese with a level of freedom no civilian could ever achieve. He was a man who understood how to wait for the perfect moment of vulnerability. His 1997 conviction led to the creation of the first specialized serial crimes unit in Greece. a direct response to the realization that their ancient, peaceful landscapes could hide such modern, calculated evil. Kyriakos Papachronis remains in a maximum security prison in Greece as of early 2026. He has never expressed remorse for his actions, maintaining the same cold silence that defined his life in the barracks. His case is still the definitive study for Greek criminologists, a reminder of the day when the myth of the vampire was replaced by the much more terrifying reality of the man in the green fatigues. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is a person who knows exactly how to disappear into the background. It is a skill that turns a familiar landscape into a trap, where the silence is just a sign that the hunter is already there. On the other side of the world, in the high frozen cathedrals of the French Alps, a group of hikers was about to learn that nature has its own way of hunting those who don't hear the warning. Five in the morning, on the western face of Mont Blanc. The air at 12,000 feet is thin and sharp, carrying the faint metallic scent of frozen granite. Jacques, a veteran guide, felt the familiar rhythmic bite of his crampons into the ice. Behind him, 4 hikers followed his exact footsteps, their breathing heavy but synchronized. The world was a monochromatic study in gray and white, waiting for the first touch of the sun. For the group, this was the culmination of years of training. They were on the Gouda route, the most popular path to the summit of Europe's highest peak. To them, the mountain was a majestic challenge, a place of clean lines and predictable physics. They had studied the maps and checked the gear. Jacques had done this climb 100 times, and his presence provided a steady, quiet confidence that everything would proceed according to the plan. Jacques watched his clients carefully. They were strong, motivated, and respectful of the altitude. The goal was the summit, but the priority was the rhythm of the ascent. They moved through the early hours with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. There is a specific kind of peace found at high altitude, a clarity that comes when your entire world is reduced to the next step and the sound of your own steady heartbeat against the silence. The summer of 1997 had been record-breaking across Europe. In the valley of Chamonix, tourists were lounging in t-shirts, enjoying a heat wave that seemed like a gift. Up on the mountain, that heat was a different kind of force. Jacques noted that the snow was softer than it should have been at dawn. Instead of a hard crystalline crust, the surface felt slightly heavy, as if the mountain itself was beginning to sweat under the weight of the warmth. They reached the Tête Rousse glacier as the sky began to turn a pale, bruised violet. The glacier was a vast, sloping field of ice that acted as the final approach to the most notorious section of the climb. To a casual observer, it looked like a pristine playground. But to an experienced guide like Jacques, the glacier was a living thing. He looked at the deep blue fissures of the crevasses and the way the light caught the ice, sensing a subtle shift in the environment. As they approached the edge of a deep gully known as the Grand Couloir, Jacques stopped and raised a hand. The silence of the mountain was being interrupted by a sound that did not belong. It was a faint rhythmic dripping like a leaky faucet hidden deep behind a wall of stone. He looked up at the towering western face above them. The sun had not yet touched the summit, but the air felt heavy and thick, lacking the crisp, dry bite that keeps the mountain frozen. The Grand Couloir is a narrow funnel of rock 30 meters wide that every climber must cross to reach the Gouda hut. Jacques looked at the floor of the gully. It was littered with fresh, sharp-edged debris that had not been there the day before. From somewhere high above a single stone the size of a baseball broke loose. It did not tumble. It flew, making a high-pitched whizzing sound like a bullet as it passed through the air and shattered against the wall. Jacques signaled for the group to stay pinned against the rock wall. Suddenly, the dripping sound was replaced by a series of sharp, explosive cracks, like the report of a rifle echoing through the stone. A section of the ridge hundreds of feet above them gave way. A boulder the size of a refrigerator tumbled into the funnel, followed by a cascading river of granite. The ground beneath their boots vibrated as the mass of rock accelerated, reaching 60 miles per hour. High above in the thin air, a helicopter from the elite French mountain police banked sharply toward the couloir. The pilots had been monitoring the mountain all morning, their infrared sensors picking up unusual thermal activity in the rock face. They saw the dust cloud rising from the gully and knew exactly what was happening. To the investigators in the sky, the mountain was no longer a solid object. It was a crumbling pile of stone held together by nothing. The crews understood the grim mathematics of the Grand Couloir. In a normal year, rockfall was a periodic hazard, but 1997 was different. The heat had penetrated deep into the fissures, melting the permafrost that acts as the mountain's structural glue. They watched from a distance as several groups of hikers were forced to retreat, realizing that the route had transformed into a shooting gallery where the interval between volleys was shrinking. Jacques realized the danger was not just the rocks they could see. The heat wave had turned the couloir into a natural funnel for every loose object on the western face. The mountain was not just shedding its surface, it was undergoing a structural collapse. The permafrost that had stayed frozen for thousands of years was gone, leaving behind a vertical maze of loose stone that could be triggered by something as small as a shift in the wind or a change in the light. Jacques watched for a gap in the falling debris. He gripped the safety cable, his muscle tension reaching a breaking point. When the roar of the last rock subsided, he shouted for the group to run. They scrambled across the 30 meters of exposed ground, their boots sliding on the loose grit. Halfway across, a second volley of stones began to sing past their ears. The sound was a terrifying high-frequency hum, the physical manifestation of gravity reclaiming the stone. They reached the safety of the far ridge, just as a second larger slide choked the couloir with dust. The truth of 1997 was that the Alps were changing. The unseasonable heat had redefined the risks of high-altitude mountaineering, turning a routine crossing into a game of mountain roulette. The physics were simple. When the ice melts, the stone follows. It was a mass casualty season that eventually forced the authorities to close the peak for safety. The antagonist in the Grand Couloir is not a person or a predator, but the relentless pull of erosional gravity. It is a force that waits for the sun to weaken the mountain's grip. Jacques and his group survived, but many others that year did not. They were victims of a landscape that had become structurally unstable, a place where the terrain had turned against the people who sought to master it through sheer will and preparation, leaving only the sound of falling rock. In 2026, the Grand Couloir is equipped with a sophisticated system of traffic lights and seismic sensors that warn hikers when the rockfall is reaching critical levels. It remains the most lethal section of any routine hike in the Alps. The events of 1997 serve as the primary case study for how climate shifts can turn a familiar path into a death trap, proving that even the most solid granite has a breaking point in the summer sun. It is one thing to see the danger falling from the sky in a place where gravity is the only law. It is another thing entirely to find it waiting for you inside a silent, locked room in the most sacred city on earth. Sometimes the most secure places are the ones where the shadows run the deepest, and no amount of faith can stop what is coming through the door. A heavy silence was already waiting in a place that was supposed to be beyond the reach of violence. 9 in the evening on May 4th, 1998, the air inside the Vatican apartments was cool and smelled of old paper and beeswax. A young guard stood at his post near the bronze doors, the weight of his halberd familiar in his gloved hand. He adjusted his grip as a heavy brass key turned in a lock further down the hall. The sound echoed off the high marble ceilings, a sharp metallic click that broke the absolute silence of the evening. Alois Esterman walked through the corridors with a sense of quiet accomplishment. He was 43 years old and had just been promoted to commander of the Swiss Guard. It was a role he had spent 18 years preparing for, a position of immense prestige within the smallest city-state on earth. He was a man of discipline, known for his sharp attention to detail and his unwavering loyalty to the Holy See. To him, the Vatican was not just a workplace, it was a sanctuary of tradition. His wife, Gladys Meza Romero, was waiting for him in their private apartment. She was 39 years old and had become a fixture in the community of guards and their families. Their life was defined by the unique rhythms of the Vatican, a world where the modern century felt like a distant rumor. They lived in a space where every door required a specific key and every hallway held centuries of secrets. For the Estermans, the promotion felt like the final piece of a life well lived. The Swiss Guard is the oldest standing army in the world, a small group of elite soldiers tasked with the personal protection of the Pope. To wear the striped uniform is to step into a lineage of sacrifice. Esterman took this responsibility with a level of seriousness that bordered on the religious. He spent his days reviewing security protocols and ensuring that every man under his command understood the weight of the oath they had taken. He was the guardian of the guardian. Gladys often sat in their living room looking out over the manicured gardens and the massive dome of St. Peter's Basilica. The apartment was filled with personal items, framed photographs, books on history, and small mementos from their travels. It was a comfortable home, a rare pocket of normalcy inside a fortress of ceremony. She supported her husband's career with a quiet grace, understanding that his duty often came before his own comfort or time. Cedric Tournay was a 23-year-old vice corporal who had been with the Guard for 3 years. He was known for being enthusiastic, though occasionally impulsive. He took pride in his service, often writing home to his mother in Switzerland about the honor of standing watch. Like the other young men, he lived in the barracks following a strict schedule of drills and prayer. To his peers, he was just another soldier trying to make his mark in a world of rigid hierarchy. The morning of May 4th had been a whirlwind of ceremonies and congratulations. Esterman had received his official commission, and the entire Guard had felt a sense of renewal. There was a celebration planned for later in the week, but for now the commander wanted nothing more than a quiet evening with his wife. He moved through the final checkpoints of the day, his boots making a steady, rhythmic sound on the polished marble floors of the Apostolic Palace. At roughly 9:15, a junior officer noticed that the lights in the Esterman apartment were still burning bright, which was unusual for the disciplined commander. He walked past the door, pausing when he noticed a slight smudge on the brass handle. He did not think much of it at the time, but as he continued his patrol, he felt a strange, lingering sense of unease. The air in the hallway seemed thicker, carrying a faint iron scent that did not belong in the living quarters. He reached the end of the corridor and checked his watch. It was time for the evening change of the watch, but Cedric Tournay had failed to report for his post. This was highly uncharacteristic for the vice corporal, who was usually 10 minutes early for every assignment. The officer waited another 5 minutes listening for the sound of boots on the stairs, but the only thing he heard was the distant tolling of a bell from somewhere deep within the city walls. The officer decided to return to the Esterman apartment to see if Tournay had been sent there on a late-night errand. He knocked on the heavy wooden door, but there was no response. He tried the handle, and to his surprise, the door was unlocked. It swung open with a slow, deliberate creak, revealing a hallway that was perfectly neat and undisturbed. He stepped inside his hand, moving toward the radio at his belt, as the smell of fresh blood suddenly became overwhelming. He found them in the living room. Alois Esterman lay near the doorway, his uniform stained a deep dark red. Gladys was a few feet away, her hand still clutching a small throw pillow. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the mantel. The officer's breath came in short, jagged hitches as he realized the magnitude of what he was seeing. There was a sense of unnatural violence in a place that was supposed to be beyond the reach of the world. Further into the room, he found Cedric Tournay. The young vice corporal was slumped against a wall, his service pistol lying just inches from his hand. The scene was static, a tableau of horror that seemed to defy the logic of the Vatican's peaceful history. The officer backed out of the room, his boots sliding slightly on the polished floor. He reached for his radio, his voice shaking as he called for the emergency response team to report to the commander's quarters immediately. Within minutes, the apartment was filled with high-ranking officials and security personnel. The doors to the corridor were locked, and a perimeter was established. The news moved through the small city like a shockwave. By midnight, the Vatican had released an official statement. They declared that Cedric Tournay had killed the commander and his wife in a fit of rage after being denied a decoration and then turned the gun on himself. The case was closed in less than 3 hours. The speed of the conclusion was unprecedented. No independent autopsy was performed, and the crime scene was cleaned with a level of efficiency that left investigators outside the Vatican stunned. The official narrative was that a disgruntled soldier had snapped under the pressure of discipline. But for those who knew the victims, the story felt incomplete. They looked at the 3 bodies and saw a tragedy that required a much deeper explanation than a simple denied promotion. Muguette Baudat, Cedric's mother, refused to believe the official version. She knew her son was not a killer, and she began a decades-long fight to uncover the truth. She hired her own forensic experts to review the limited information the Vatican provided. They found a series of troubling inconsistencies. The path of the bullet that killed Cedric did not match the angle of his own gun, and there were bruises on his body that suggested he had been in a struggle before he died. Rumors began to circulate through the back channels of European intelligence. Some suggested that Alois Estermann had a secret past as a spy for the East German Stasi, and that his promotion had triggered a cleanup by those who wanted his secrets to stay buried. Others pointed to internal power struggles within the Vatican itself, suggesting that the three deaths were a message. The horror was the realization that the most secure city on Earth might have been breached by a hitman. Ballistic experts noted that a fourth bullet was found in the room, one that did not match Tournay's weapon. This led to the theory of a fourth man, someone who had entered the apartment, committed the murders, and staged the scene before slipping back into the shadows of the Apostolic Palace. The idea was chilling, a killer who could move through the most guarded hallways in the world without being seen or heard, leaving behind a narrative that everyone was forced to accept. For 25 years, the case has remained a source of intense debate and speculation. The Vatican has consistently denied requests to reopen the investigation or to allow external researchers to access the case files. They maintain that the murder-suicide was the only logical explanation. But for the families involved, the silence is a physical weight. They live with the knowledge that the truth is buried somewhere behind the thick stone walls and the layers of religious tradition. The investigation revealed that the lock on the apartment door had not been forced, which meant the killer either had a key or was someone the Estermanns trusted enough to let in at 9 in the evening. The lack of struggle from the commander, a trained soldier, suggested that the attack was swift and professional. It was a case of clinical execution, disguised as a crime of passion, a masterclass in staging that fooled the world's oldest army for nearly 3 decades. The killer in this story is a shadow, a presence that utilized the absolute security of the Vatican as a shield. By committing the act in a sovereign state with its own legal system, they ensured that the truth would be managed by those who value stability over transparency. The fourth man is a ghost that still haunts the halls of the Swiss Guard, a reminder that even the most sacred of spaces can be turned into a crime scene by someone who knows how to use the silence. In 2026, the Vatican's secret archives regarding the 1998 case remain sealed to the public. Private investigators continue to use modern ballistic modeling to prove that the official story is physically impossible. The Estermann apartment has long since been renovated, and new guards walk the same hallways every night. But the iron scent of that evening still lingers in the memory of those who refuse to believe that the case is truly closed. Some secrets are buried under layers of tradition and law held in place by people who believe that stability matters more than the truth. But nature has a different way of hiding things, using silence and time to cover its tracks. In a place where the air smells of sulfur and the ground itself is alive, a different kind of burial was waiting for two people who thought they were just out for a hike. Hendra tightened the nylon straps of his backpack, feeling the weight of the 3-day supply of water and dry noodles shift against his spine. It was late afternoon in 1997, and the air on the lower slopes of Mount Merapi was thick with the scent of wet ferns and damp earth. He looked over at his friend Thomas, who was checking his boots. They stood just beyond a rusted metal sign that warned of the high danger zone. The terrain under their feet was a mix of dark volcanic soil and tangled roots that felt like tripwires in the fading light. Ahead of them, the mountain rose in a perfect, terrifying cone, its summit hidden behind a permanent veil of white steam. The sound of the surrounding jungle was a frantic mess of bird calls and insect drones. Hendra took a step forward, crossing the invisible line that separated the safe world from the forbidden one. Hendra was 24 years old and had spent the last 3 years working in a crowded office in Jakarta. He was the kind of man who spent his weekends studying topographical maps and reading survival guides. He felt a constant itching need to be somewhere where the rules of the city did not apply. For him, Merapi was the ultimate destination. It was not just a mountain, it was a living, breathing entity that demanded respect and offered a raw, primal perspective. He had grown up hearing stories about the mountain from his grandfather, who described Merapi as a king who required offerings to stay calm. In Java, the volcano is central to the spiritual life of the people. But Hendra saw it through a different lens. He saw it as a technical challenge, a test of his endurance and his ability to navigate extreme environments. He had spent months preparing for this trip, obsessing over the details of his gear. Thomas was a childhood friend who shared Hendra's thirst for adventure, but lacked his meticulous nature. He was 25 and worked as a freelance photographer, always looking for the one shot that would define his career. He followed Hendra's lead, trusting his friend's research and planning. To Thomas, the danger was just a backdrop that made the photos more compelling. He carried a heavy camera bag and a tripod, ready to capture the summit at dawn. They spent the first night in a small village on the edge of the exclusion zone. The locals were polite but distant, their eyes lingering on the heavy packs and the expensive hiking boots. Hendra noticed the way the older men looked toward the summit, their faces unreadable. There was a sense of quiet resignation in the village, a collective understanding that they lived at the mercy of the fire mountain. To them, the danger was not a thrill, it was a constant fact of life. The next morning, they bypassed the military checkpoint by taking a narrow trail used by sulfur collectors. The path was steep and slick with mud, requiring them to use their hands to pull themselves up the vertical sections. Hendra felt a surge of adrenaline as they moved deeper into the forest. He enjoyed the feeling of being unmonitored away from the gaze of the authorities. He checked his compass frequently, ensuring they stayed on the northern ridge. As they climbed higher, the lush greenery of the base began to thin out, replaced by stunted trees and gray skeletal shrubs. The air grew colder and carried a faint, persistent scent of sulfur that reminded Hendra of burnt matches. He liked the physical exertion, the way his muscles burned and his lungs expanded to take in the thinning air. It made him feel more alive than he ever did in the city, where every comfort was provided and every risk was managed. Hendra took out a small leather-bound diary and noted their coordinates. He liked to keep a record of his journeys, documenting the weather, the terrain, and the specific feeling of the landscape. He wrote about the silence of the high slopes, a quiet so deep that he could hear the blood rushing in his ears. He described the volcano as a silent giant, watching them with an ancient, indifferent gaze as they crawled up its flanks like ants. Thomas was busy setting up his tripod to capture the light hitting the lower valleys. He talked about the contrast between the green jungle and the gray volcanic rock. He was excited, his voice echoing in the thin air. Hendra watched him for a moment, feeling a sense of camaraderie. They were two young men in their prime, standing on the edge of the world, doing exactly what they wanted to do. The risks seemed small compared to the reward. They reached the 3,000-meter mark by late afternoon on the second day. The ground was now composed of loose volcanic scree that slid beneath their boots with every step. For every 2 feet they moved forward, they slid back 1. Hendra enjoyed the struggle. He liked the way the mountain fought back, requiring them to earn every inch of progress. They found a relatively flat ledge and decided to set up their camp for the night. Hendra pounded the tent stakes into the hard ash-covered ground, ensuring the shelter was secure against the high-altitude winds. He felt a sense of pride in their campsite. It was efficient, organized, and perfectly positioned for the final push to the crater in the morning. He cooked a small pot of noodles over a portable stove, the blue flame flickering in the twilight. They ate in silence, watching the stars appear in a sky that was free from city light. The mountain was unusually quiet that night. There were no sounds of animals or insects, only the low, steady hum of the wind passing over the jagged rocks. Hendra lay in his sleeping bag, looking up at the thin fabric of the tent. He felt a strange vibration in the ground, a rhythmic thrum that was so subtle he wasn't sure if he was imagining it. He dismissed it as the sound of his own pulse, a side effect of the altitude and the exhaustion. The first offbeat detail appeared just as the moon rose over the ridge. Hendra stepped out of the tent to relieve himself and noticed that the air felt strangely warm, as if a heater had been turned on nearby. He looked toward the summit and saw a series of faint, pulsing lights deep within the crater. They were not the orange glow of lava, but a pale, shimmering blue that seemed to dance against the steam. It was beautiful and deeply unsettling. He went back into the tent and woke Thomas, telling him about the lights. Thomas grabbed his camera and stepped outside, his excitement overriding any sense of caution. He began taking long exposure shots, hoping to capture the phenomenon. Hendra watched him, feeling a growing sense of unease. The smell of sulfur had become much stronger now, smelling like rotten eggs, and a thin layer of fine gray dust was beginning to settle on the outside of the tent. Hendra opened his diary and wrote a short entry about the warmth and the lights. He noted that the ground felt soft, as if the rock beneath them was beginning to lose its solidity. He wrote about a low, growling sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth, a vibration that made the water in their bottles ripple. He didn't use the word fear, but his handwriting was tighter and more hurried than it had been just a few hours earlier. The pressure began to rise as the growling sound grew into a steady, low-frequency roar. It was not a loud noise, but it was one that Hendra could feel in his teeth and his chest. He looked at the tent stakes and saw that they were vibrating in the soil. Thomas was still focused on his camera, talking about the incredible shots he was getting. He didn't seem to notice that the wind had died down completely, leaving the air heavy and stagnant. Hendra realized they were in a position of limited escape. The trail they had taken was too steep to navigate in the dark, and the slopes around them were a maze of loose rock and hidden drops. He decided they should pack up and move further down the ridge, away from the direct line of the summit. He began pulling the gear out of the tent, his movements quick and urgent. He didn't explain why, and Thomas didn't ask, sensing the shift in his friend's energy. Just as they were collapsing the tent, a sudden heavy silence fell over the mountain. The growling sound stopped, and the air became deathly still. Hendra stood perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs. He heard a soft whispering sound coming from above, like the rustle of silk or the falling of dry leaves. It was a gentle, almost peaceful noise that grew louder with every second, filling the air with a rhythmic, pulsing quality. Hendra looked up and saw a massive dark cloud rolling down the side of the crater. It didn't look like smoke or ash. It looked like a wall of gray velvet moving with an impossible fluidity. It was a nuée ardente, a pyroclastic flow of superheated gas and rock. It moved without the roar of an avalanche, sliding silently over the terrain at over 100 miles per hour. In the dark, it was almost invisible, a shadow moving within the shadows. A year later, in 1998, a search team led by a local ranger was moving through the high-altitude ravines near the summit. The landscape had been completely transformed by the eruption, the lush greenery replaced by a monochromatic world of gray stone and hardened ash. They were not looking for survivors anymore. They were looking for any sign that the mountain had not completely erased the two men who had disappeared into the exclusion zone. The ranger, a man named Sutopo, noticed a flash of color near a sheltered ledge. As he approached, he realized it was a fragment of blue nylon sticking out of a mound of hardened grit. He began to dig with a small shovel, his movements careful and methodical. He uncovered the corner of a tent, its fabric brittle and scorched. It was buried under 12 inches of fine gray ash that had acted as a seal, protecting the contents from the weather. The search team worked in silence, uncovering the remains of the campsite. Everything was perfectly in place, as if the owners had just stepped away for a moment. They found 2 sleeping bags, a portable stove, and a heavy camera bag. The camera itself was melted, its plastic casing fused into a distorted lump of black slag. But inside a waterproof container, they found a leather-bound diary, its pages crisp and perfectly preserved despite the heat. Sutopo opened the diary and began to read the final entries. He was struck by the clinical, detailed descriptions of the lights and the warmth. The last entry was dated the night of the disappearance. It described a soft whispering sound and a wall of gray moving down the mountain. The handwriting ended abruptly in the middle of a sentence, a single ink smudge marking the moment the silence of the volcano finally caught up with the writer. An investigator from the Indonesian Volcanological Survey arrived a few days later to examine the site and the recovered items. He looked at the melted camera and the scorched tent fabric, noting the specific patterns of the heat damage. To him, the scene was a textbook example of a low-magnitude pyroclastic surge. The hikers had been caught in the outer edge of a flow that was hot enough to melt plastic, but moved so quickly it didn't ignite the fabric. The investigator explained that the nuée ardente is one of the most terrifying forces of nature because of its stealth. Unlike a lava flow, which is slow and bright, a pyroclastic flow is a gravity-driven hurricane of ash and gas. It can reach temperatures of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Because it is denser than the surrounding air, it hugs the ground, flowing into every ravine and over every ridge, silencing everything in its path before the victims even know they are in danger. The twist in the Merapi case was the discovery of how the mountain had sculpted the site. The ash that buried the camp was composed of tiny glass shards and pulverized rock. When it hit the tent, it was hot enough to flash seal the air inside, creating a pocket of preservation. The hikers had not been crushed. They had been vaporized by the heat, their biological remains becoming part of the very ash that covered their gear. The mountain had essentially absorbed them. The truth revealed by the site reconstruction was that the hikers never had a chance to run. The soft sound Hendra had described in his diary was the sound of the air being displaced by the oncoming flow. By the time they heard it, the superheated gas was already upon them. The tragedy was the result of a volcanic event that was too small to be picked up by the regional monitors, but large enough to delete 2 human lives in a single silent heartbeat. The case of the Merapi hikers became a cautionary tale in Indonesian mountaineering circles. It highlighted the unpredictable nature of the red zone and the cultural belief that the mountain is a living god that takes what it wants. The site of the camp remains a place of pilgrimage for those who want to understand the raw power of the volcano. It is a reminder that in the high places, the silence is often the most dangerous thing you can hear. The killer in this story was the invisible reach of the Earth's internal heat. Mount Merapi is a stratovolcano that is perpetually in a state of restlessness, its lava dome constantly growing and collapsing. The 1997 event was a reminder that even when the mountain appears to be sleeping, it is breathing out a heat that can erase any trace of human presence. The hikers were turned into a permanent part of the gray volcanic landscape they so desperately wanted to explore. In 2026, the summit of Mount Merapi remains under a permanent high-danger ban during periods of increased seismic activity. The exclusion zone is monitored by a network of thermal cameras and gas sensors, all aimed at preventing a repeat of the 1997 disappearance. The diary of the lost hiker is kept in a local museum, a silent witness to the night the mountain decided to stop watching and started moving. The soft sound of falling ash creates a world of total silence, a gray blanket that mutes the sounds of life and covers the mistakes of those who venture too far. Sometimes the earth hides our presence so completely that only a few melted objects remain to tell the story. But other mysteries are born from human choices, where a single silent bullet can change the course of a life in a place dedicated to the pursuit of pure logic. On a bright sunny morning in Rome, the ancient halls of a university were filled with the sound of students rushing to their next lecture. It was a place of higher learning where the laws of philosophy and the weight of history were the only things people worried about. But in the heart of the sapienza, a ghost was about to pull a trigger, launching an experiment in murder that would terrify a nation and leave behind a riddle with no easy answer. It was 11:42 in the morning on May 9, 1997, at the Sapienza University of Rome. The spring sun was high and bright, reflecting off the ancient marble buildings and the cobblestone paths of the campus. Thousands of students were moving between classes, their voices creating a low constant hum that defined the heart of the city's intellectual life. Marta Russo was walking with her friend Iolanda, enjoying the warmth of the day as they navigated the crowded lanes. The air was filled with the scent of roasted coffee and the faint, dry smell of old stone dust. Marta was laughing at something her friend had said, her steps light and rhythmic on the pavement. To anyone watching, they were just 2 more students in a sea of young people caught up in the shared energy of a Friday morning. There was no sound of a struggle, no engine revving, and no raised voices. The world was functioning exactly as it was supposed to, in the heart of Rome. Marta was 22 years old and a dedicated law student with a bright future ahead of her. She was not just an academic overachiever, she was also a champion fencer who understood the value of discipline and focus. Her life was a series of planned steps toward a career in legal philosophy, a field that fascinated her because it dealt with the underlying logic of human behavior and justice. She lived a life of clean lines and clear goals that were rooted in hard work. She grew up in a household where education and curiosity were valued above all else. Her father was a physical education teacher and her mother a homemaker, and they had raised Marta and her sister to be independent and thoughtful. To her parents, Marta was the reliable one, the daughter who always called home and never missed a deadline. She carried herself with a quiet grace that made people trust her instantly. Her smile was easy and genuine, often brightening the dark library aisles. The university was her second home, a labyrinth of history and knowledge where she felt a deep sense of belonging. She loved the tradition of the place, the way the modern world of the 90s intersected with the centuries of thought that had happened in those very rooms. On that morning, she had been discussing her thesis with friends, her mind full of abstract concepts and the excitement of her coming graduation. She felt as though she was finally standing on the threshold of her real life. Marta's passion for fencing had taught her how to anticipate an opponent's move before they even made it. She understood the geometry of a strike and the importance of a single, precise moment. In the fencing hall, she was known for her composure under pressure and her ability to remain perfectly still until the exact second she needed to move. This sense of physical awareness made her appreciate the world around her in a way that most people missed, noting the rhythm of the city. Rome in 1997 was a city of transitions caught between its ancient roots and the digital age that was beginning to take hold. For Marta, the university represented the best of both worlds. She spent hours in the law library, surrounded by the smell of leather-bound books and the scratching of pens on paper. She was fascinated by the idea of the perfect legal system, a structure that could provide order and safety to everyone equally. It was a goal she intended to dedicate her life to. Her morning had started like any other. She had shared a quick breakfast with her family, checked her bag for her notebooks, and headed toward the campus. The commute was a familiar sequence of sights and sounds that usually provided a sense of comfort. She watched the people at the bus stop and noted the way the light hit the ancient facades of the buildings. Everything felt stable and predictable, a shared reality that she navigated with the confidence of someone who knows where they are going. Marta and Iolanda were walking through a section of the campus known as the Piazzale della Minerva. It was a wide-open space surrounded by the heavy, fascist-era architecture of the law and philosophy departments. Hundreds of students were sitting on the steps or leaning against the walls, soaking up the midday sun. The two friends were discussing a lecture they had just finished their conversation, moving from academic points to their plans for the upcoming weekend. She was wearing a light sweater and had her hair pulled back, a simple look that suited her practical nature. As they walked, she adjusted the strap of her bag, her eyes scanning the crowd for a familiar face. She felt a deep sense of camaraderie with the people around her, a feeling of being part of something larger and more important than herself. The university was a sanctuary for her, a place where ideas were the only weapons and the only goal was the truth. Iolanda noticed how animated Marta was becoming as she talked about a recent court case they had studied. Marta had a way of leaning into a conversation, her hands moving to emphasize a point. She was a woman who was fully present in the moment, her energy infectious to those around her. They passed a group of students playing music near a statue, the low strumming of a guitar mixing with the sound of the distant city traffic. It was a perfect, ordinary moment in the life of a student. They were heading toward the political science building, a short walk that they had done dozens of times before. Marta was on the inside of the path closest to the buildings that housed the humanities departments. She was mid-sentence, her head turned slightly toward Iolanda, when she suddenly felt as though her legs had simply turned to water. There was no pain and no warning. 1 second she was walking, and the next the world was rushing up to meet her. Iolanda heard a sudden heavy thud on the pavement and realized that Marta was no longer beside her. She turned around, expecting to see her friend had tripped or perhaps fainted in the heat. She saw Marta lying perfectly still on the cobblestones, her bag spilled out beside her and her eyes wide and unfocused. Iolanda dropped to her knees, calling Marta's name, her voice rising in a sudden sharp panic that cut through the low hum of the courtyard. People began to gather around the two girls, their faces masks of confusion and concern. A few students who were pre-med students rushed forward, checking Marta's pulse and trying to see if she was breathing. They assumed she had suffered a sudden seizure or a stroke. There was no scream, no sound of a gunshot, and no sign of an attacker. To the people standing just feet away, it looked as though the young woman had simply been deleted by a ghost. One of the students noticed a small dark stain beginning to spread on the pavement beneath Marta's head. He carefully moved her hair aside and saw a tiny clean hole near her right ear. It was so small it looked like it could have been made by a stray piece of wire or a sharp stone. He didn't understand what he was seeing, but he felt a cold, primal chill. He looked up at the surrounding windows, but every pane was reflecting the bright sun, hiding whatever was inside. The pressure in the courtyard shifted from confusion to a heavy, suffocating dread. The first responders arrived within minutes, their sirens wailing through the narrow streets around the university. They pushed through the crowd, their movements clinical and hurried. They lifted Marta onto a stretcher, her body limp and silent. Yolanda stood back, her hands shaking as she watched her friend being carried away. She looked at the spot on the ground where Marta had fallen, unable to process the speed of the change. At the hospital, the doctors initially shared the confusion of the students. They looked for signs of a natural cause, but when they performed a routine X-ray of her skull, the reality of the situation silenced the room. There, nestled deep within the brain tissue, was a small lead projectile. It was a .22 caliber bullet. Marta Russo had been shot in the head in broad daylight, in the middle of a crowded university campus, and no one had heard a single sound. The discovery sent a shockwave through the Italian legal system. The police descended on the Sapienza University, cordoning off the Piazzale della Minerva and turning the campus into a high-security crime scene. They were looking for a weapon, a motive, and a killer who had managed to fire a shot from a distance into a moving target without being detected. It was a feat of impossible precision that defied every standard theory of urban violence. Detectives began the grueling process of calculating the trajectory of the bullet. They used lasers and string stretching lines from the spot where Marta fell back toward the surrounding buildings. They were looking for a window, a rooftop, or a balcony that provided a clear line of sight. The math was cold and unforgiving. It led them directly to a window on the first floor of the Philosophy of Law department, a room known as Room 6. The investigation inside the university was met with a wall of intellectual silence. The faculty and staff were defensive, unable to reconcile the idea of a murder happening within their halls of higher learning. The police searched every classroom and office, looking for a hidden weapon or a spent casing. They found a collection of legal texts and philosophical treatises, but the gun that had fired the ghost bullet was nowhere to be found. It had vanished along with the shooter. As the days passed without an arrest, the Italian public became obsessed with the case. It was dubbed the murder of the Sapienza sniper. People were terrified by the random nature of the crime. Marta was a girl with no enemies, no debts, and no dark secrets. She was simply a girl walking to class. The lack of a motive was the most terrifying part of the story. It suggested that anyone could be a target at any time for no reason at all. The police began to focus on the people who had access to Room 6 on the morning of May 9th. They were mostly graduate students and teaching assistants, people who spent their days discussing abstract concepts of justice and morality. Among them were two young men, Giovanni Scattoni and Salvatore Ferraro. They were brilliant, ambitious, and deeply immersed in the world of legal philosophy. They were the kind of people Marta would have studied with. A secretary who worked in the department, Gabriella Aletto, became the central figure in the investigation. At first, she denied seeing anything unusual that morning. But after weeks of intense controversial interrogation, her story began to shift. She claimed that she had walked into Room 6 and seen Scattone holding a pistol while Ferraro looked out the window. She described them as being calm, as if they were performing a routine lab experiment rather than a murder. The prosecution's theory was a masterpiece of dark academia. They argued that Scattone and Ferraro had not killed Marta out of anger or revenge. Instead, they suggested that the two intellectuals had committed a Nietzschean experiment. They wanted to see if they could commit the perfect crime, a murder with no motive, fired from a distance that would leave the legal system they studied so carefully completely paralyzed by its own logic. They argued that Marta was chosen simply because she happened to be in the crosshairs at the exact moment the experiment was ready. To the killers, she was not a person. She was a philosophical variable, a way to test a theory in the real world. The idea that someone could be murdered as a technical challenge was a horror that the Italian public found impossible to grasp. It shattered the sanctity of the university and the trust in the intellectual elite. The trial was a spectacle of legal maneuvering and conflicting testimonies. Scattone and Ferraro maintained their innocence, their lawyers pointing to the lack of a weapon and the shifting stories of the star witness. They argued that the prosecution was trying to fit a complex reality into a sensationalized narrative. The courtroom became a battleground of ideas, where the life of a young woman was almost lost behind the weight of the philosophical debate. In the end, the physical evidence of the trajectory and the testimony of the secretary were enough for a conviction. Giovanni Scattone was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, and Salvatore Ferraro was convicted of aiding and abetting. The sentences were relatively light, which only added to the sense of injustice felt by Marta's family. They had lost their daughter to a senseless act of intellectual vanity, and the system she believed in seemed unable to provide a clear answer. The truth revealed by the investigation was a chilling look into the potential for cold, detached violence within the human mind. The Sapienza sniper was not a common criminal. He was a man who had lost his connection to the reality of human suffering. He had treated a life like a line of text in a book, something to be analyzed and manipulated for the sake of an argument. The ghost bullet was the physical manifestation of a mind that had gone too far into the abstract. Marta Russo's death changed the way the Italian public viewed the university system. It led to a massive overhaul of campus security and a deeper discussion about the ethical responsibilities of those in positions of intellectual influence. The courtyard where she fell is now a place of quiet reflection, a reminder of the fragility of life and the danger of ideas that are divorced from empathy. Her story is a permanent part of the university's history, a shadow that never fully lifted. Marta's legacy lives on through the foundation started by her family, which promotes organ donation. Her final act was one of incredible generosity. Her organs saved the lives of 5 people, turning a tragedy into a gift of life for others. It was a gesture of pure humanity that stood in direct opposition to the cold clinical logic of her killers. She provided a final lesson in justice that was far more powerful than anything taught in the classrooms of the Sapienza. In 2026, the case remains a subject of intense debate among legal scholars and private researchers. Giovanni Scattone has long since served his sentence and been released, continuing to maintain his innocence in various interviews. There are still those who believe that a different sniper, perhaps a professional who utilized the chaos of the university, was the true shooter. The mystery of the ghost bullet continues to flicker in the dark corners of Italian legal history. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is not a weapon, but an idea that has lost its heart. It is a force that can turn a bright, sunny morning into a nightmare and a place of learning into a crime scene. But as the sun sets over the marble halls of Rome, the trail leads west across the border and into the quiet, sun-drenched plains of Portugal. In the Alentejo region, the heat is so intense it can drive a person to madness. It is a landscape of golden cork forests and deep, heavy silence that stretches for miles between the small stone farmhouses. In early 1998, that silence was about to be broken by a shepherd who noticed something unusual sitting in the shade of an old tree. He found a piece of luggage that had traveled a very long way across a national border to deliver a cargo that hadn't seen the light of day in months. The shepherd expected to find smuggled gold or perhaps vintage wine hidden away from the tax collectors. He didn't know that he was about to step into a mystery that would bridge 2 countries and expose a predator who used the sleepiness of the countryside as his primary weapon. The creak of the leather hinges would be the last thing he heard before the reality of the Alentejo trunk murder finally came to light in the summer heat. Early morning in 1998, the Alentejo sun was already beginning to pull the moisture from the golden grass. A shepherd named Manuel followed his flock through a grove of ancient cork trees. The only sound was the rhythmic clinking of the sheep bells and the occasional snap of a dry branch underfoot. It was a landscape of deep, heavy silence that felt like it had been standing still for centuries. Manuel was 64 years old and had spent every day of his life in these plains. He knew the way the light shifted across the hills and the specific heat that meant a storm was coming from the coast. To him, the Alentejo was a place of predictable peace. People here did not ask questions about their neighbors, and they did not look for trouble. They simply lived by the rhythm of the land and the needs of their animals. Hundreds of miles away in Seville, Spain, the city was alive with a different kind of energy. The narrow streets of the old quarter were filled with tourists looking for the perfect guest house. A young woman traveling alone found a charming building with whitewashed walls and a heavy wooden door. The owner was a man who spoke softly and offered a room with a view of a small, quiet courtyard. It felt like a lucky find. She spent her days exploring the cathedrals and her evenings writing letters to her family about the heat and the beauty of Andalusia. She was a woman who enjoyed the independence of travel, the freedom of being someone no one knew. To her, the guest house was a sanctuary from the noise of the city. She did not mind the way the owner occasionally lingered in the hallway, or the fact that the cellar door was always locked. Her room was small but clean, smelling faintly of lavender and floor wax. She had a routine of stopping at a local cafe for breakfast and returning late to avoid the worst of the midday sun. The owner was always there to greet her, his smile polite and his eyes hidden behind thick glasses. He was a man of discipline, someone who seemed to manage his house with a level of precision that provided a sense of order. She did not notice that the other guests seemed to change every few days, or that the owner spent a great deal of time in the basement. To her, it was just the natural rhythm of a transient place. She was focused on her own journey, her mind full of the sights and sounds of Spain. She felt a deep sense of calm in the quiet of the guest house, unaware that her presence was being noted with a very different kind of attention. Manuel led his sheep toward a familiar stone farmhouse that had been abandoned since the 70s. In the shade of a large cork tree, he saw something that did not belong to the forest. It was a vintage leather steamer trunk, its brass buckles gleaming in the harsh light. It sat perfectly upright on the dry earth, looking as if it had been placed there with great care. There were no tire tracks and no signs of a struggle nearby. As he got closer, Manuel noticed a dark, viscous fluid leaking from the bottom of the trunk. It had pooled on the ground, creating a stain that was attracting a thick swarm of Mediterranean flies. The air around the tree carried a cloying, heavy scent. It was not the smell of the forest or the animals. It was a mixture of dried lavender and something much sharper like iron and spoiled meat that made the sheep pull back. Manuel reached out with his wooden staff and nudged the lid. The leather hinges made a long, slow creak that sounded like a groan in the silent grove. He expected to find smuggled goods or perhaps some vintage wine left behind by a traveler. But as the lid shifted, the smell became a physical weight that hit him in the chest. He saw a layer of fine lace and a heavy blanket soaked through with the same dark, oily substance. He used the end of his staff to pull back the fabric. Beneath the lace, he saw the curve of a human shoulder and a shock of dark hair. The body was tucked into the trunk with a level of effort that suggested a powerful, organized person. Manuel did not scream. The silence of the alentejo was too deep for that. He simply stood there for a long moment, the sun burning the back of his neck, before turning and walking back toward his village. The local police in Beja received the call at noon. They were used to petty thefts and disputes over land boundaries, not a discovery that looked like something out of a noir film. When the officers arrived at the grove, they found the trunk exactly as Manuel had left it. The heat was now intense, and the flies were a buzzing cloud around the tree. They realized immediately that they were looking at a crime of extreme calculation. Inspector Coimbra was the man assigned to the case. He was a veteran detective who understood the culture of silence in the region. He looked at the trunk and saw a signature. It was an archaic, theatrical way to dispose of a body. He began the grueling process of tracing the manufacturer of the luggage, which led him across the border into Spain. He realized the killer had used the open borders of the late 90s to hide his trail. Coimbra worked with the Spanish authorities in Seville, sharing photographs of the victim's clothing and the unique brass buckles of the trunk. They searched the files of missing tourists looking for a match. The investigation moved slowly through the narrow streets and the guest houses of the old quarter. They were looking for a man who was strong enough to move a heavy steamer trunk alone and organized enough to plan a cross-border journey. The forensic team found something that changed the entire meaning of the case. Despite the heat of the alentejo, the body showed a level of preservation that was physically impossible for the timeline. It was as if the victim had been killed months ago, but had only recently started to decompose. This meant the killer had a way to keep the body cold. They were not looking for a common criminal. They were looking for someone with a cellar or a vault. They tracked the trunk to a specific guest house in Seville, where the owner had a reputation for being an eccentric collector of vintage luggage. When Coimbra and the Spanish police arrived, the house was perfectly quiet. The owner welcomed them with a soft smile and a polite nod, his eyes hidden behind thick glasses. He seemed like a man of absolute discipline, a pillar of the local community who took great pride in the order of his home. They forced the lock on the cellar door and found themselves in a space that was 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house. The room was filled with more trunks, all lined up against the stone walls. The smell of lavender was overwhelming. In the center of the room was a large industrial cooling unit. They found forensic evidence that the cellar had been used to store the victim for weeks before the killer decided to take his cargo into the forest. The killer had utilized the open borders of 1998 to move the trunk through checkpoints without being searched. He had driven through the night, crossing from Spain into Portugal, under the cover of the silent countryside. He chose the Alentejo because he knew no one would ask questions about a strange car in a remote grove. He viewed the disposal as a final act, a way to place his victim in a landscape as silent as his cellar. The investigation revealed that the man was a predator who specialized in disappearing his female tenants. He would watch them for days, learning their rhythms and their vulnerabilities, before striking in the quiet hours of the morning. He saw himself as a collector, and the trunks were his displays. The 1998 trial exposed a network of illegal guest houses where people could vanish without a ripple in the administrative record. The guest house predator had a military background in logistics, which explained his ability to plan the cross-border transport. He had spent years perfecting the art of concealment, using the ordinary sights of a tourist city to mask his spree. He did not see his victims as people, but as additions to a collection that he curated with clinical precision. He remains one of the most studied killers in the history of Portuguese and Spanish forensics. In 2026, the Alentejo trunk murder is still used as a primary case study for Interpol's cross-border homicide training. The farmhouse near the grove has long since collapsed, but the shepherd's story remains a permanent part of the local folklore. The case proved that even in the most silent corners of the countryside, the weight of the truth will eventually find a way to break through the surface of the golden grass. Sometimes the things we try to hide in the deep silence of the forest have a way of crying out when the sun hits them just right. But there is another kind of silence that happens when the ground itself disappears, leaving you to wonder if the path ahead is even there at all. In the high clouds of South Africa, a beautiful white mist was about to descend, turning a familiar mountain stroll into a labyrinth with no exit. It was late afternoon in 1997, on the flat summit of Table Mountain. The sky over Cape Town was a brilliant hard blue, but a single massive white cloud was beginning to spill over the northern cliffs like thick cream. It looked soft and inviting. From the city below, a natural wonder locals call the tablecloth. Up on the plateau, the air was still smelling of sun-warmed fynbos and salt from the Atlantic. Carl was 32 years old and visiting from Germany. He was an experienced hiker who had spent years navigating the Bavarian Alps, so a 1,000-meter mountain right in the middle of a major city did not seem like a significant threat. He stood near the edge of the plateau, looking down at the miniature cars moving along the coastal roads. To him, the proximity to civilization was a guarantee of safety. He had spent the morning exploring the city's waterfront before taking the cable car up to the top. The ride had been smooth and tourist-filled, reinforcing the idea that Table Mountain was essentially a high-altitude park. He carried a small day pack with a single bottle of water and a light windbreaker. He planned to spend an hour walking the flat paths of the summit before returning in time for a seafood dinner at the harbor. The summit of Table Mountain is a sandstone monolith that feels like a different world. It is a flat, rocky maze of ancient stone and unique vegetation that exists nowhere else on Earth. Carl enjoyed the isolation, finding it strange that he could feel so far away from the world while still being able to see the skyscrapers of the central business district. He followed the well-marked trails, his boots crunching on the grit. He stopped to watch a small lizard sunning itself on a rock. The sun was warm on his back, and the light had a golden late-summer quality that made the colors of the mountain pop. Carl felt a deep sense of relaxation. He had been working long hours in Frankfurt, and this trip was his first real break in 3 years. He took a deep breath of the mountain air, appreciating the silence that only exists above the tree line. He looked toward the east, where the rugged peaks of the 12 Apostles stretched out toward the horizon. The mountains looked like the spine of a sleeping beast, ancient and indifferent. Carl checked his watch and realized he had wandered a bit further than intended. He decided to turn back toward the cable station, keeping the distant city skyline as his primary landmark. It was a simple, logical way to navigate a flat space. As he walked, he noticed how many people were still heading out onto the trails. There were families with young children and couples in sandals, all enjoying the spectacular views. It was a shared experience of beauty that made the mountain feel communal and protected. Carl felt a sense of camaraderie with the other hikers nodding as they passed each other. The risk seemed non-existent in such a well-traveled and beautiful place. He reached a high point near the Maclear's Beacon and looked back toward the edge of the mountain. The city was still there, but the perspective had shifted. The shadows in the deep ravines were growing longer, and the light was beginning to take on a reddish hue. He liked the feeling of being a temporary guest in such a dramatic landscape. He didn't know that the weather in the subantarctic waters to the south was already changing. The first offbeat detail was a sudden sharp drop in the temperature. It wasn't a gradual cooling as the sun went down, but a biting, ice-cold dampness that seemed to arrive on a single gust of wind. Carl stopped to pull on his windbreaker, noticing that the sound of the city had been replaced by a low, rhythmic whistling. He looked back toward the northern edge and realized that the city skyline was no longer visible at all. The tablecloth was no longer just a cloud on the horizon. It was a physical wall of white that was pouring over the cliffs with incredible speed. It moved like a liquid, filling the gullies and swallowing the landmarks one by one. Carl watched as a group of hikers just 50 yards ahead of him simply vanished into the mist. Within seconds, the brilliant blue sky was gone, replaced by a featureless, blinding whiteout. The pressure rose as Carl realized he could no longer see the trail beneath his feet. The whiteout was so dense that he felt a sudden terrifying sense of vertigo, as if the ground had been tilted at a 45-degree angle. He took a step forward, but the air felt thick and resistant. He reached out his hand and could barely see his own fingers. The silence was now absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that muffled every sound. He tried to stay calm, telling himself to follow the slope of the land back toward the cable station. But Table Mountain's flat top is a trap in a whiteout. There are no ridges to follow, only a series of blind gullies and false paths that lead in every direction. He felt a sudden sharp panic as he realized he had no idea which way he was facing. Every direction looked identical, a void of white where the earth and sky had merged. By 7 in the evening, the cable car operators realized several people had not returned. They called the wilderness search and rescue teams, who arrived in the dark as the cloud continued to roar over the summit. The volunteers moved onto the plateau in small groups tethered together by ropes. They called out names into the mist, but the high-pressure wind of the tablecloth carried their voices away before they could be heard. The discovery was not made that night. The storm grew in intensity, forcing the search teams to retreat for their own safety. It wasn't until the cloud finally lifted the following morning that they found Carl's daypack lying on the edge of a sheer 1,000-foot drop near Platiclip Gorge. There were no footprints in the wet sand, only a single scuffed mark where someone had lost their balance and reached out for a handhold that wasn't there. The investigation turned into a grim census of the mountain's hidden places. As the teams rappelled into the deep vertical ravines that cut into the sandstone, they found more than just the victims of that week. They found a ledger of the lost remains of hikers from years prior that had never been recovered. The mountain was a vertical labyrinth that kept its secrets in the shadows of the cliffs where the sun never reached. Searchers moved through the blind gullies with a sense of heavy clinical purpose. They found that many victims had died not from the fall itself, but from exposure. They had wandered off the trail in the mist and found themselves trapped on ledges they couldn't escape from. The proximity to the city was the ultimate cruelty. From these ledges, the victims could see the lights of the apartment buildings and hear the sirens of the city. The twist in the search for the German tourist came when a volunteer spotted a shadow moving on a ledge just 10 feet below the summit rim. It wasn't Carl, but another hiker who had been missing for over 24 hours. He was standing on a shelf of rock, no wider than a dinner plate, his heels hanging over a 200-meter drop. He was perfectly still, paralyzed by the sight of the city lights shimmering in the distance. The volunteer described the rescue as one of the most haunting moments of his career. The man on the ledge was so close to safety that he could have reached out and touched the trail if the mist hadn't hidden it. He had spent the entire night listening to the hum of the traffic and the sound of people talking in the gardens below while he was pinned to a vertical wall of stone, waiting for the ground to reappear beneath him. The climax of the 1997 season was a series of high-profile disappearances that forced the city to reconsider its relationship with the mountain. The authorities realized that the ease of the cable car ride created a dangerous illusion of safety. People were treating a sub-Antarctic environment like a city park entering a vertical wilderness without the proper gear or respect for the speed of the weather changes. Carl was never found. His disappearance remains one of the many unsolved cases on Table Mountain, a reminder that the desert and the sea are not the only places where a person can be erased. The sandstone cliffs are riddled with deep fissures and hidden caves where a body can remain undiscovered for decades. The mountain is a silent warden guarding the entrance to the city, while holding on to those who underestimate its power. The truth revealed by the search and rescue logs is a study in atmospheric physics. The tablecloth is an orographic cloud formed when moist air from the ocean is forced up the mountain slopes and cools instantly. It is a high-pressure wind that does not just obscure vision, it creates a psychological hypnosis. Hikers become disoriented so quickly that they often walk directly off the cliffs while believing they are on flat ground. In 2026, the mountain is monitored by a network of real-time LiDAR sensors that can track the formation of the tablecloth from miles away. Automated warnings are sent to hikers' phones as soon as the pressure shifts. Yet the 1997 season remains the benchmark for mountain survival training in South Africa. It serves as a reminder that the proximity of a city is no protection against the elements. That same season, in 97 thousands of miles away in Mexico, the ground was not just disappearing behind a wall of mist. It was being buried under a weight that fell from the sky. Sometimes the earth decides to speak with a voice of fire and ash, turning the world gray and silent in a single afternoon. In the shadow of a volcano named Don Goyo, a village was about to be deleted by a falling curtain of volcanic glass. Arturo, a 54-year-old farmer, stood in the dusty main square of Santiago Zalatzintla, looking up at the massive snow-capped peak that dominated the horizon. It was a Tuesday morning in late June of 1997. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of roasting corn from a nearby kitchen. At his feet, a small dog napped in the dirt, its tail occasionally twitching to ward off a persistent fly. To Arturo, the volcano was not a threat. It was a neighbor, a grandfatherly figure that had watched over his family for generations. He had spent every day of his life working the fields of maize and beans that clung to the lower slopes. He understood the mountain's moods, noting the way the steam vented from the crater in a thin, lazy plume. For Arturo, the routine of the village was tied to the constant presence of the giant. Each year he joined the pilgrimage to the high ridges to leave offerings for the mountain spirit. They brought flowers, food, and music, hoping to keep the giant in a state of peaceful slumber. It was a tradition that bridged the gap between his Catholic faith and the ancient beliefs of his ancestors. Inside the colonial-era church, the statues of the saints seemed to share a quiet understanding with the smoking mountain outside. Life in Zalatzintla was a tapestry of small, predictable moments. Arturo would wake before dawn, drink a cup of strong, sweet coffee, and head out to his fields with his mule. He enjoyed the physical work, the way the dark soil felt between his fingers and the rhythmic sound of the hoe hitting the earth. He felt a sense of security in the shadow of the peak, protected from the noise and the chaos of Mexico City, which sat over the ridge. He often thought about his children who had moved to the city for work, and how they had lost their connection to the rhythm of the land. They sent letters talking about the traffic and the smog, but Arturo preferred the clean air and the silence of the highlands. He took pride in the fact that his farm was self-sufficient, providing everything he and his wife needed to live a modest life. The mountain was the silent partner in his success. On Sundays, the village square would fill with people from the surrounding hamlets. The market was a riot of color, with brightly dyed fabrics, piles of red chilies, and baskets of yellow squash blossoms. Arturo would sit on a stone bench and talk with the other farmers about the weather and the coming harvest. They would look up at the summit of Popocatépetl and nod with respect, acknowledging that their lives were lived by the grace of the volcano. Arturo's wife Maria spent her mornings tending to the small garden behind their house. She grew medicinal herbs and colorful marigolds that she would take to the church on feast days. The house was a simple structure of adobe and wood, with a heavy tiled roof that had been in the family for 80 years. It was a place of stability, where the memories of the past were woven into the walls and the future seemed as certain as the rising sun. The volcanic soil was a gift Arturo never took for granted. It was rich and dark, holding the moisture from the morning mists long into the afternoon heat. He often told his neighbors that the mountain provided for them because they treated it like a member of the family. There was no fear in his heart, only a deep sense of belonging to a landscape that was far older than the language he spoke or the clothes he wore in the square. In the late afternoons, Arturo would often sit on his porch and watch the light change on the mountain's western face. The snow would turn a soft pink, and the shadows would stretch out across the valley like long, dark fingers. He felt a profound peace in those moments, a clarity that came from knowing exactly where he stood in the world. The mountain was a landmark for his soul, a permanent anchor in a world that was constantly changing. The village children played in the narrow streets, their laughter mixing with the sound of the wind through the pines. They were raised with stories of Don Goyo, the spirit of the mountain, who could be as kind as a father or as stern as a judge. Arturo would sometimes stop and tell them about the great eruptions of the past, not to frighten them, but to teach them about the power of the earth they lived on. It was a shared heritage of the high peaks. He remembered his own father taking him to the timberline for the first time. The air had been so thin it made his head spin, but the view of the world below had been worth every struggle. He had seen the patchwork of farms and the silver ribbons of the rivers, all protected by the massive presence of the volcano. It was a moment of realization that he was a small part of a very large and ancient story, one that would continue long after he was gone. Even the architecture of Zalitzintla reflected the mountain's influence. The houses were built with thick walls to keep out the chill of the high altitude, and the roofs were pitched steeply to shed the summer rains. There was an organic quality to the village, as if it had grown out of the earth itself. Arturo felt a deep pride in his community, seeing it as a testament to the resilience of people who choose to live on the edge of the world. The local priest often spoke about the volcano in his sermons, describing it as a manifestation of God's power and majesty. To Arturo, this made perfect sense. He saw no contradiction between his faith and his respect for the mountain. Both provided a sense of order and meaning to his life, a framework for understanding the world around him. He felt that as long as he followed the rules of the land and the church, he would be safe and provided for. As the summer heat began to build in late June, Arturo noticed that the springs near his farm were running lower than usual. He did not think much of it, attributing the change to a lack of rain in the early spring. He continued his work, trusting that the mountain would provide the water they needed eventually. He was a man of immense patience, shaped by a lifetime of waiting for the seasons to change and the crops to grow in their own time. The first offbeat detail arrived on a Monday evening when the air became deathly still. Arturo was sitting in his courtyard when he noticed that the birds had stopped singing entirely. Even the crickets were silent. A low rhythmic vibration began to hum through the soles of his boots, a sound that was felt more than heard. It was as if the earth itself was clearing its throat, a deep frequency rumble that made the water in his ceramic jug ripple. He walked to the edge of his property and looked up at the summit. The lazy white plume had been replaced by a dense, dark column of steam that looked like bruised muscle. The smell of sulfur, usually a faint reminder of the mountain's life, was now sharp and abrasive like a handful of burnt matches held under his nose. Arturo felt a sudden cold prickling of sweat at the base of his neck. For the first time in his life, the mountain felt like a stranger. Maria came out to join him, her face etched with a worry he had never seen before. She felt the vibration too, a steady thrum that seemed to be coming from the very center of the house. They stood together in the silent courtyard, watching as a few small rocks began to tumble down the steep ashen slopes near the crater. The mountain was waking up, and the peaceful daily life Arturo had known was beginning to fray at the edges like old cloth. The pressure reached a breaking point by noon on June 30th. A massive explosion rocked the entire valley, a sound so powerful it shattered the windows in the village square and knocked Arturo to his knees. A plume of ash and gas shot 13,000 meters into the sky, creating a pillar of absolute darkness that blocked out the midday sun. Arturo watched in horror as the sky turned a dim metallic copper, then faded into a deep, unnatural night. The day was being deleted by a shadow that had no end, turning the vibrant landscape into a monochromatic wasteland. The temperature in the village began to rise, a dry, suffocating heat that carried the weight of the underworld. Arturo gathered Maria and their most important belongings, heading toward the church, where the villagers were already congregating. The air was becoming difficult to breathe, filled with a fine, gritty dust that scratched his throat. He looked back at his farm one last time and saw that the vibrant green of his maize fields was already disappearing under a thin layer of gray. The mountain he had loved his entire life was now raining down a curse of pulverized stone. Arturo felt a sense of betrayal, a profound disorientation, as the landmark of his soul turned into a source of terror. He hurried Maria through the square, their boots kicking up clouds of ash that tasted like burnt matches. The ash began to fall in earnest, but it was not soft like snow. It was a heavy, abrasive rain of pulverized rock and volcanic glass. Arturo heard the sound of it hitting the metal roofs of the market stalls, a relentless static noise like millions of tiny needles being dropped from the sky. Within an hour, the world was 10 inches deep in gray grit. The landmarks he had known his entire life, the paths and the stone walls, were being erased by the falling sky. He reached the heavy wooden doors of the church, just as the darkness became absolute. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of incense and fear. The villagers were huddled together, praying in low, rhythmic voices that were muffled by the falling ash outside. Arturo sat on a wooden pew, holding Maria's hand, listening to the weight of the mountain as it settled onto the roof. Every few minutes, a heavy thud signaled a section of the tiles giving way. The sound of the ash was a constant hissing presence, a reminder of the thousands of tons of rock that were descending from the sky. Arturo felt the air in the church growing warmer and heavier, making every breath a struggle. He thought about the hikers he had seen earlier in the week, wondering if they were still on the mountain. He knew that out in the high ravines, there was no shelter from the gray curtain that was deleting the world. 30 miles away, a team of rangers from the National Disaster Response Unit were struggling to navigate the high-altitude roads. Their trucks were equipped with heavy-duty air filters, but the fine ash was already beginning to choke the engines. They were looking for a group of hikers who had been seen near the crater just before the eruption. The radio was a mess of static and frantic calls from the monitoring stations reporting the height of the plume. The head ranger, a man named Eduardo, stared through the windshield at a world that had lost all color. The headlights of the truck were useless, reflecting off the falling grit and creating a wall of gray. He checked his GPS, but the signals were being scrambled by the atmospheric interference from the eruption. He knew that out in the ravines, any footprints would be buried in minutes. They were searching for shadows in a place where the light had died. Eduardo felt the truck slide on the loose ash, the tires struggling to find traction on a surface that felt like dry grease. He ordered his men to put on their respirators, the sound of their heavy breathing filling the cramped cabin. They were moving through a landscape that was fundamentally changing with every second. The mountainside they had mapped for years was being smoothed over the sharp edges of the terrain, replaced by soft, deadly mounds of gray grit. The twist in the search arrived when Eduardo realized that the landscape had become a fluid, shifting trap. The ash was not sitting still. It was flowing like water into the ravines, filling 50-foot drops until they looked like flat ground. He saw a hiker's trekking pole sticking out of a mound of gray, but as he stepped toward it, his boot sank nearly 2 feet into the loose, hot grit. The mountain was not just covering the world, it was rewriting the topography. Eduardo realized with a cold dread that the hikers were likely not just lost, but literally buried in place. The rate of accumulation was so fast that a person standing still for 10 minutes could be pinned to the ground by the weight of the ash. The erasure was total. Every trail and every sign of human presence was being deleted by the falling curtain of pulverized stone. The search was no longer a rescue. It was a race against a permanent gray burial. He looked at his team and saw the same realization in their eyes. They were standing in a modern-day graveyard that was still being built by the sky. The weight of the ash on their own trucks was becoming a concern, the metal roofs groaning under the pressure. Eduardo knew they had to turn back. There was nothing more they could do for those caught in the high zones. The mountain had reclaimed its territory, and it was using the sky to enforce the border. Back in the village, Arturo heard a terrifying structural groan from the church ceiling. The weight of the ash had reached a critical mass. Suddenly, a section of the heavy timber rafters snapped with a sound like a lightning strike. A cascade of hot gray grit poured into the sanctuary, burying the altar and the first few rows of pews. The villagers scrambled toward the rear of the building, their lungs burning from the dust that now filled the entire room. Arturo pulled Maria through the side door, stepping out into a world that was hot and suffocating. They waded through the ash, which felt like walking through deep, dry mud. He could hear the sound of other roofs in the village collapsing under the weight, a series of muffled thuds that signaled the destruction of his home. He felt a sudden sharp pain in his chest as he realized that the stable world he loved was gone, buried under the weight of the mountain. He saw the colonial fountain in the square, once a center of village life, now just a gray mound of stone. The trees were sagging, their branches snapping under the immense weight of the volcanic grit. Arturo felt a sense of powerlessness he had never known. The mountain he had respected his whole life was now an indifferent engine of destruction. He kept moving, his eyes stinging from the abrasive dust, focused only on reaching the safety of the lower valley. The forensic reconstruction of the 1997 event revealed the true nature of volcanic ash. It is not an organic material. It is a weight of pulverized glass and rock that is twice as heavy as snow. When it accumulates on a structure, it creates a lateral pressure that most buildings are not designed to withstand. The 1997 eruption turned the surrounding villages into a modern Pompeii, where the air itself became a lethal weapon. The hikers were never found. Their equipment and remains were buried deep within the ash layers that filled the high ravines, becoming a permanent part of the mountain's new profile. They were deleted from the map in a matter of minutes, lost in a landscape that had been stripped of its history. To this day, searchers believe their bodies are still there, perfectly preserved within the gray, airless casing of the cold volcanic stone. In 2026, Popocatépetl remains on a yellow phase, too alert its lazy plume, a constant reminder of the power that lies beneath. The village of Santiago Xalitzintla has been rebuilt, but the 1997 eruption remains the primary evacuation model for all of central Mexico. Arturo's farm is a different shape now, the soil enriched by the ash, but he never looks at the summit without remembering the weight of that gray, silent afternoon. It is a tragedy when nature decides to bury a village in a layer of ash. It is a mystery when a government decides to bury a massive cruise ship in a layer of concrete. Sometimes the ground hides our mistakes, and sometimes it is forced to hold on to them by people who fear what the light might reveal. In the dark, freezing waters of the Baltic, a different kind of seal was being prepared for a cargo that was never meant to see the sun. The Baltic Sea in 1997 felt like a place that was trying to hold its breath. 80 meters below the surface, the MS Estonia lay on her starboard side, a massive steel tomb resting in the soft glacial clay. The water was a freezing ink-black void, where the pressure could crush the life out of anything that did not belong. There was no light down here, only the low, distant hum of the salvage ships waiting above. The hull was 500 feet of twisted metal, a silent monument to a night that changed everything for the countries surrounding these waters. In 1994, the ferry had been a symbol of connection between Estonia and Sweden. It was a place of music, laughter, and high seas luxury. Now it was a resting place for 852 souls, most of whom were still trapped inside the cabins when the ocean rushed in. By 1996, the site had become a forbidden zone. The Swedish government, along with Finland and Estonia, had signed a unique treaty declaring the wreck a site of sanctity. It was meant to protect the dead from grave robbers and curious divers. But to the families of those who never came home, it felt like a wall was being built around their grief. They wanted the bodies recovered, but the authorities said it was impossible. The official stance was that recovering the victims would be too technically difficult and emotionally scarring for the divers. They argued that the ship should remain, as it was a permanent underwater cemetery. But the survivors remembered the speed of the sinking. They remembered how the bow visor had supposedly failed, allowing the car deck to flood. They had questions that the official investigation was not answering fast enough. In early 1997, the government announced a plan that sounded like something out of a pharaoh's dream. They were not going to raise the ship, and they were not going to send divers in to retrieve the remains. Instead, they were going to bury the entire vessel under tens of thousands of tons of sand and concrete. It was an engineering project of unprecedented scale, designed to seal the Estonia away from the world forever. The project was handed to a salvage giant called Smittac. They were professionals, the kind of people who deal with the world's most difficult maritime disasters. They arrived on site with a fleet of specialized ships, including massive dredgers and pipe-laying vessels. To the crew on the surface, it was just another job, a matter of moving volume and hitting targets. But for the families watching from the shore, it looked like an erasure. The plan involved a three-step process. First, they would surround the wreck with a massive amount of sand to stabilize the seabed. Then they would lay down a layer of heavy stones to prevent the sand from washing away in the currents. Finally, they would pour a thick shell of concrete over the entire structure. It was intended to be a sarcophagus, a modern-day pyramid that would keep the ship hidden for 1,000 years in the dark. The work began in the spring, during the window of time when the Baltic is at its most temperamental. The weather was often gray and choppy, with cold winds whipping across the deck of the support ships. The divers who were sent down to monitor the progress described an eerie, heavy silence near the wreck. They moved through the gloom with powerful lights, seeing the rows of cabin windows that would soon be covered by a wall of grit. There was a specific kind of pressure on the project. The government wanted it finished quickly before the autumn storms made the work impossible. Every day, the sand ships would arrive, their hulls heavy with sediment dredged from the surrounding sea floor. They would position themselves directly over the wreck using GPS to stay perfectly still against the shifting tides. Then the process of filling the void would begin in earnest. On the seabed, the sand did not just fall, it hissed. It moved through the water like a thick gray cloud, slowly settling over the white paint of the Estonia's hull. It covered the railings, the lifeboats that never launched, and the windows of the grand dining hall. For the divers watching through their visors, it was like seeing a city being slowly buried by a desert. The scale of the burial was difficult for the mind to grasp. Many of the crew members felt the moral weight of what they were doing. They knew that just a few inches of steel away from the sand were the remains of hundreds of people. They were essentially creating a mass grave that would never be reopened. It was a job that required a certain level of emotional detachment, a focus on the engineering rather than the tragedy. They worked in 12-hour shifts, rarely speaking about what lay below. The exclusion zone was patrolled by the Swedish Coast Guard, who kept a constant watch for any unauthorized vessels. They were instructed to intercept anyone who tried to approach the site, whether they were journalists or grieving relatives. The air of secrecy around the project only fueled the rumors that were already circulating in the ports of Stockholm and Tallinn. People wondered why so much effort was being spent to hide a wreck. One of the divers, a man who had spent years in the North Sea, later described the feeling of being near the hull as the sand began to pile up. He said it felt as though the ship was sighing, the metal creaking under the weight of the new earth. It was a sound that stayed with him long after he returned to the surface. He felt like he was participating in a funeral that had no end, a burial that was being performed in total silence. The engineering fleet was a floating city of steel and cranes, lit up like a beacon in the middle of the dark sea. From a distance, the lights looked peaceful, a sign of human progress against the elements. But close up, the atmosphere was one of clinical industry. The constant thrum of the pumps and the grinding of the gravel chutes created a background noise that never stopped, even when the sun dipped below the horizon at night. By the summer of 1997, the first stage was nearly complete. The Estonia was no longer a recognizable ship from the outside. She was a massive, humpbacked mound of sand and rock on the floor of the Baltic. The transition from a vessel to a geographic feature was almost total. The engineers were preparing for the final phase of the project, the pouring of the concrete shell that would seal the tomb for good. The sheer volume of material being moved was staggering. Hundreds of ship movements were required to transport the rocks and sand from the mainland to the site. The logistical complexity of the operation was a testament to the government's commitment to the burial. They were willing to spend tens of millions of dollars to ensure that the ship remained unreachable. It was a physical manifestation of a desire to put the past behind them. Despite the official narrative of sanctity, many people in Sweden and Estonia were deeply uncomfortable with the project. They saw it as an expensive way to ignore the calls for a full investigation. They felt that the concrete shell was being built to hide the mistakes of the past, rather than to honor the victims. The debate played out in the newspapers and on the evening news, but the work at sea continued without interruption. That was when the first offbeat detail began to emerge. Despite the millions of dollars being spent, the sand was not staying where it was supposed to. The currents at 80 meters were stronger than the initial surveys had predicted. The sediment was shifting, revealing sections of the hull that had been covered just days before. It was as if the mountain was refusing to stay buried, a slow-motion struggle between the sea and the stone. The engineers had to adjust their plans, bringing in even more material to compensate for the drift. The urgency of the project increased, with the government pushing for completion at any cost. This frantic pace led to mistakes. Some of the stone layers were laid down unevenly, and the divers reported that the wreck was shifting in the soft clay under the new weight. The stability they were trying to create was becoming a nightmare. A sense of deep unease began to settle over the salvage fleet. They were fighting a battle against an environment that did not want the sarcophagus there. Every time they thought they had achieved a solid seal, the underwater cameras would show a new gap or a section where the sand had washed away. It was a rhythmic tightening and release of tension, a constant fear that the entire project would collapse before the concrete could be poured. The sonar equipment began to pick up strange readings from the seabed. The mounds they were building were not holding their shape, instead forming jagged, unstable slopes that threatened to slide away into the deep. The engineers were baffled by the behavior of the sediment. It seemed to defy the models they had used to plan the burial. The mountain of sand was behaving like a living thing, constantly shifting and reshaping itself. As the pressure rose, the rumors turned into something more substantial. Whispers from the intelligence community suggested that the Estonia had been carrying secret Soviet-era military technology on the night she sank. People began to ask if the sarcophagus was really about sanctity, or if it was an attempt to prevent anyone from seeing what was in the cargo hold. The idea of a cover-up began to overshadow the official narrative. The point of no return came when the government realized that the concrete shell might not even work. The technical challenges were mounting, and the cost was spiraling out of control. Public opinion was turning against the project, with many people seeing it as a disrespectful and expensive way to hide the truth. They began to wonder what the Swedish authorities were so afraid of that they would try to bury a ship in a shell of stone. The exclusion zone became a place of high-stakes confrontation. The Coast Guard was forced to fend off more and more private vessels as the public's curiosity grew. Every day that the project remained unfinished was a day that the mystery was allowed to fester. The authorities were desperate to finish the seal, but the Baltic was refusing to cooperate. The weather turned sour, with a series of late summer gales that stalled the work. Inside the support ships, the mood was becoming grim. The engineers were working long hours to find a solution to the shifting sand, but every proposal seemed to come with a new set of risks. They were operating in a state of constant low-level anxiety, knowing that the eyes of the world were on them. The moral weight of the burial was starting to show in the faces of the crew, who just wanted to finish the job and go home to their lives. In the middle of this chaos, a discovery was made that changed the trajectory of the story. A German journalist named Judah Rabe decided that the treaty did not apply to her. She organized an illegal expedition to the site, hiring a team of professional divers and a support ship that could operate outside the jurisdiction of the Swedish Coast Guard. She wanted to see the wreck for herself before it was lost under the concrete forever. The Rabe expedition arrived at the site under the cover of a moonless night. They had to work fast, knowing that the Coast Guard would be on them as soon as they were detected. They launched a remotely operated vehicle, or ROV, into the dark water. The camera feed flickered to life, showing the grainy, green-tinted landscape of the seabed. They saw the mounds of sand and the jagged rocks of the partially completed sarcophagus project. As the ROV moved along the side of the hull, the team saw something that the official investigation had never mentioned. In a section of the ship that should have been covered by the sand, there was a massive 4-meter hole in the steel. The edges of the metal were bent outward, suggesting an explosion or a high-energy impact from the inside. It was a detail that destroyed the official story of a simple visor failure and a sinking. The discovery sent the expedition into a state of shock. They realized they were looking at evidence of a catastrophic event that had been kept from the public for years. The urgency to document the whole was overwhelming, as they knew the sand ships would be returning within hours to continue the burial. They recorded as much footage as they could, their hearts hammering against their ribs in the cramped and humid control room of the boat. The search for the truth had suddenly become a race against the engineering project. Rabe's team believed they had found the reason for the sarcophagus. The government was not trying to protect the dead, they were trying to bury the evidence of why they died. The hole in the hull suggested a collision with a submarine or a bomb in the cargo deck, something that would have caused the ship to sink in less than an hour of time. The investigation into the Rabe footage was met with a fierce response from the authorities. They claimed the footage was faked, or that the hole was caused by the ship hitting the seabed during the sinking. But the engineering community was skeptical. The damage was too specific and too violent to be a simple result of the descent. The debate over the sarcophagus reached a fever pitch, with families demanding an end to the burial. Under immense public and political pressure, the Swedish government finally decided to abandon the concrete project in late 1997. They had already spent over $30 million and moved thousands of tons of material, but the ship remained partially uncovered. The technical failure of the sand layers and the explosive nature of the rave discovery had made the sarcophagus an impossible goal for the engineers. The site was left in a strange, half-buried state. The Estonia was now a distorted landscape of rusted metal and gray grit, a place that was neither a ship nor a grave. The attempt to erase the truth had only succeeded in creating more questions. The engineering of silence had failed, leaving behind a riddle that would continue to haunt the Baltic for the next 3 decades. The ship remained in the dark, waiting for the light to return. The abandoned mounds of sand and stone became a new hazard on the seabed. They shifted in the currents, occasionally revealing glimpses of the white hull to passing sonar scans. The sarcophagus project had become a monument to a failure of transparency, a physical scar on the floor of the sea. For the families, it was a reminder of the length to which the system would go to avoid answering the questions that kept them awake at night. For years, the story of the hole remained a fringe theory dismissed by official sources and mainstream media. But the twist came in 2020, when a new documentary team used advanced sonar and high-definition cameras to scan the wreck. They found the 4-meter hole exactly where Jutterab said it was. The modern footage was undeniable, showing that the hull had been breached by an external force that had been ignored. This new evidence broke the prior assumptions of the maritime community. It suggested that the 1997 sarcophagus project was indeed a deliberate attempt to seal off a crime scene. The realization that the government had tried to use thousands of tons of concrete to hide a hole in a ship was a horror that many found difficult to process. The weight of the stone was not for the dead, but for the safety of the living. The climax of the Estonia story is the ongoing battle for a full reconstruction of the sinking. In 2024 and 2025, new dives were authorized to study the hull damage in detail. The investigators found that the ship had been carrying military equipment on at least 2 occasions prior to the sinking. The connection between the intelligence cargo and the hole in the hull was becoming a terrifying reality. The truth revealed by the latest investigations is a story of geopolitical secrecy and a total failure of transparency. The MS Estonia did not just fall apart. She was a victim of a chain of events that the world was not meant to understand. The attempt to bury her in 1997 was the final act in a tragedy of silence, an engineering project designed to turn a mass grave into a permanent and unreachable secret for all time. The concrete sarcophagus is now a partially collapsed shell on the floor of the Baltic. It serves as a reminder that the ocean does not like to keep our secrets, and eventually the water finds a way to reveal what we try to hide. The system that wanted the evidence to disappear has been forced to confront the reality that the truth is often heavier than 10,000 tons of stone. The ship still waits in the dark for a final answer. In 2026, the Estonia Treaty still technically bans diving at the site, but the international pressure for a full recovery of the victims has reached a new peak. New remotely operated vehicles have provided images of the interior that show personal items still lying on the floors of the cabins, preserved by the cold. The families are still waiting for the day when the burial is finally undone and their loved ones come home. The killer in this story is not the sea, but the faceless force of a system that valued stability over the truth. It is a force that was willing to use millions of dollars and thousands of tons of material to delete a history that was too dangerous to be told. The MS Estonia remains a silent witness to that choice, a massive steel tomb that refused to be hidden under a shell of concrete and a mountain of lies from the authorities. Sometimes the things we try to hide in the deep silence of the ocean have a way of crying out when the light finally hits them. The weight of the stone was meant to hold the truth down, but the truth is a living thing that eventually finds its way to the surface. As the sun sets over the cold, dark waters of the Baltic, the shadows of the Estonia are still there, waiting for the final word to be spoken in the quiet of the night. There is a particular kind of peace that comes when you realize that some secrets are just too big to be buried. It is a feeling that stays with you long after the fire has gone out and the room has grown cold. The world has a way of holding on to the things we lose, keeping them safe in the deep until we are ready to see them again. Sleep well, knowing that the truth is still there, resting in the quiet places where the light cannot reach. We are sitting here together in the quiet of the late night while the fire slowly burns down into embers. The world outside is dark and vast, stretching out beyond the windows and the walls of our homes. We listen to these stories because they remind us of something we often try to forget. They remind us that the edge of the world is closer than we think. We spend our lives constructing a sense of normalcy that feels solid and permanent. We believe that if we follow the rules and maintain our routines, we are shielded from the chaos. But tonight showed us that the most profound tragedies often arrive on a sunny morning or during a celebration. The ordinary is not a shield, it is just a temporary lull in the storm. Think about Marta Russo walking to her law class. She was a woman of logic and clean lines, someone who believed in the structure of justice. She did not know that she was walking through a crosshair. It was not an act of revenge or a calculated crime of passion. It was a philosophical experiment. That is the horror of the random, the idea that you can be a variable. We like to believe that we can sense danger, that our instincts will flare like a warning light when the shadow approaches. But the scruffy man on the catch did not look like a monster. He looked like a neighbor offering a bed. The tablecloth cloud did not look like a predator. It looked like a beautiful mist. Danger has a way of wearing the face of the mundane. There is a specific kind of cruelty in the way a single choice can rewrite an entire history. Ben and Olivia just wanted to sleep. They stepped off that water taxi and onto a deck that would carry them away from everything they knew. We make 1,000 choices like that every day. We turn left instead of right. We trust a stranger's smile. We assume the boat is real. We often talk about nature as if it is a conscious force, something that either protects us or punishes us for our arrogance. But the volcano and the mountain are fundamentally indifferent. They do not care about our diaries or our cameras. They do not care if we are adventure seekers or fathers. They simply exist with a raw power that can erase a human life. We live in the red zone more often than we realize. We navigate environments where the permafrost is melting or the ash is falling, and we tell ourselves it is just the weather. This normalcy bias is what allows us to sleep at night, but it is also what keeps us on the trail when the temperature drops. We are experts at convincing ourselves that the ground is solid. There is a haunting weight to the things that are left behind. A diary open in the ash, a vintage trunk in a cork forest, a single hair on a blanket. These objects become the only witnesses to a truth that people are desperate to bury. They remind us that even when the body is gone and the ship is sealed in concrete, the physical world holds on to the memory. Sometimes the burial is not a natural event, but a human choice. We saw it in the Baltic and in the silent halls of the Vatican. There is a specific kind of horror in the engineering of silence. When a system decides that order is more important than truth, it creates a sarcophagus for the living. It reminds us that we are at the mercy of those who hold the keys. We are drawn to the unsolved because it reflects the gaps in our own understanding. We want to know where the boat went. We want to know who fired the shot. These questions are a way of trying to regain control over a world that feels increasingly random. If we can solve the mystery we tell ourselves, then we can prevent it from happening. It is a form of hope. But the lesson of these stories is often simpler and more profound. It is the lesson of presence. Marta's organs saved 5 lives, turning an act of cold logic into a gift of pure humanity. In the face of erasure, the human spirit finds a way to endure. We are more than the sum of our tragedies. We are the meaning we create in the quiet hours before the shadow falls. We must learn to respect the gatekeepers of our own lives. Whether it is a voice of experience, warning us of a restless mountain, or a gut feeling that tells us to stay on the jetty. These small signals are the only defense we have against the invisible currents of the world. We should listen to the silence before it turns into a roar and watch the drifting mist. As you sit there in the dark, perhaps you are thinking about your own routines and the paths you walk every day. It is a good thing to appreciate the mundane. The sound of a key in a lock should be a sound of safety, not a sign of intrusion. The sight of a cloud should be a cause for wonder, not a reason for fear. We should be grateful for every ordinary morning. The fragility of our safety is not something to be feared, but something to be understood. It makes every shared moment more valuable. It makes every spoken sentiment more urgent. We should live with the awareness that we are all just navigating a beautiful vertical labyrinth. If we can look out for each other, perhaps we can find the way back before the light fades. I am grateful that you spent this time with me tonight. These stories are heavy, and they require a certain kind of strength to carry. By sharing them, we take a little bit of the weight off the families who are still waiting for their answers. We keep the names of the lost alive in the dark. It is a small act of justice in a world that often prefers the silence. If you are still awake, I invite you to join our community here. You can subscribe and leave a comment to tell me where you are listening from. Knowing that there are friends sitting across this fire from every corner of the map makes the night feel a little less vast. It reminds me that even in the deepest silence, we are never alone. Your presence adds meaning. Before you drift off to sleep, take one final look around your space. Ensure the perimeter is secure and the world outside is where it belongs. We should never take the silence for granted. It is a gift that can be reclaimed by the mountain or the sea at any moment. Treat your routine as the sanctuary it is, and remember that every small choice has a weight. We will return to the shadows of the past soon enough. There are many more stories to tell, many more secrets waiting to be pulled from the deep water and the gray ash. But for now, let the rain against the window be the only sound you hear. Let the fire settle into the hearth. The dark is only temporary, and the morning will come in its own time. Stay safe. The stories of 97 and 98 remind us that time is a river that can suddenly turn into a waterfall. We are all swimming in the same current, hoping to reach the shore before the tide changes. If we can keep our eyes on the landmarks and our hands on the safety cable, perhaps we can weather the storm together. The truth is always there for us. We should not look for monsters in the shadows. We should look for the gaps in our own logic. The monster is often just a man with a plan and a quiet voice. The disaster is often just a heat wave that lasted a week too long. By understanding the mechanics of the tragedy, we can learn to spot the first offbeat detail. Knowledge is the only light we can carry. Every person we talked about tonight was just looking for a way home, a way to class, or a way to the summit. Their goals were simple and human. They represent the best of us, the desire to explore, to learn, and to celebrate. We should honor that spirit by living our own lives with intention. Do not wait for the clouds to fall before you appreciate the view. There is a peace that comes from accepting our own vulnerability. It allows us to stop fighting the world and start living in it. We can acknowledge the volcano without living in fear of the ash. We can respect the ocean without being paralyzed by the depth. We are part of the landscape, not masters of it. This humility is the foundation of true safety today. I often wonder about the things we do not see, the boats that sailed past the ketch, the students who walked the path just minutes before Marta. They were all part of the same moment, yet their lives continued in a different direction. It is a reminder of how narrow the window of tragedy truly is. We are all constantly missing disasters by a matter of seconds. The silence of the Alentejo or the Baltic is not a void. It is a container for the stories that have not been told yet. By sitting here tonight, we are breaking that silence. We are saying that these lives matter, that the truth matters, and that we will not let the concrete be the final word. We are the keepers of the ledger, and we will continue to turn the pages. As the embers of the fire grow dim, I want you to feel the comfort of the space you are in. You are safe. You are warm. The stories are over for tonight, and they are back in the past where they belong. They are lessons now, not threats. You can let go of the tension in your shoulders and the weight in your chest. The rain is water, and the dark is a rest. We spend so much energy trying to solve the unsolved in the world, but perhaps the real mystery is how we find the courage to keep going. We keep climbing, we keep traveling, we keep trusting. This resilience is the true human meaning. In the face of an indifferent volcano, we leave flowers on the ridge. In the face of a locked room, we fight for the key. The world will always have its red zones and its shooting galleries. It will always have its shadows and its secrets, but it also has people like you who are willing to listen and to care. This empathy is what connects us across the map, across the years, and across the silence. It is the only thing that the mountain cannot erase and the concrete cannot bury. Tomorrow will bring its own routines and its own ordinary moments. I hope you find joy in the smell of your coffee and the sound of your own voice. I hope you find safety in the familiarity of your home and the rhythm of your day. We are the survivors of the stories we tell, and we carry their wisdom into the light. The ordinary is a gift for all of us. Thank you for sitting with me by the fire. It has been an honor to share these shadows with you. Your presence makes the stories more meaningful and the night more bearable. I will be here when the fire is lit again, ready to pull another secret from the deep water. Until then, take care of yourself and those around you. We are navigating the sounds together. The mist is lifting now and the stars are beginning to fade. The night is almost over and the world is getting ready to wake up again. Let the peace of the late hours stay with you as you close your eyes. You have heard the warnings and you have learned the lessons. The perimeter is secure. You can rest now knowing that the truth is safe in the ledger today. Before I go, I want to remind you that your support is what allows me to keep researching these cases. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and let me know where you are listening from. It helps more than you know. Your comments are a light in the dark for me, a sign that these stories are reaching the people they are meant for. I appreciate you. The fire is just a glow now, and the room is quiet. The rain has slowed to a soft drizzle, a gentle rhythm that marks the end of our time together. We have traveled a long way tonight, from the South Pacific to the heart of Europe. We have seen the best and the worst of what it means to be human. Now it is time to return to the simple reality of deep sleep. Stay safe, check the locks, and remember that the world is a beautiful vertical labyrinth that requires a steady hand and a clear heart. We are all just visitors here, doing our best to find the path back home. I will be waiting for you in the next episode, when the shadows return and the secret is revealed once more. For now, let the darkness be your sanctuary.